All right, so it's 10:15. Will, thank you very much for your prompt recording. I noticed the recording light is on, and I'd like to thank for the attendees for being here as well as the panelists. So my name is Dr. Erik Juergensmeyer. I'm the Peace and Conflict Studies Coordinator at Fort Lewis College here in lovely Durango, Colorado. And again, I'd like to welcome you to the first annual Southwest Justice, Peace, and Conflict Studies Conference. I'm really looking forward to starting a conversation today that doesn't finish today, right? That doesn't end today. I'm looking forward to making connections and making plans and establishing a path forward as we think about our needs and we learn about each other's experiences. And I think we're gonna have a lot of really good ideas today as we work forward. So to begin, I'd like for everyone to know this session is being recorded. So we will provide a link that'll be available on the Save the Kids website. It might be hosted on YouTube or it might be just statically on that website. Of course, I'd like to thank a few people for making this possible. First of all, of course, is Will Pollard. Will is kind of running things for us. I've had a lot of Zoom time, but I've never been on the front end of the Zoom webinar. So I just got a great lesson from Will. He's really good at what he does. I'd like to thank Salt Lake Community College for allowing this to happen. And I'd also like to thank Save the Kids for hosting this and providing our information. You can see all of our bios and our abstracts on the Save the Kids website if you haven't been there already. So today we're going to have 7 presenters. They'll speak for 20 minutes each. That's barring my 1-minute introduction and reading of their bios. And then following each 20-minute presentation, we've allotted a 10-minute Q&A. And that Q&A is going to take place through the Q&A, not really a module, tab in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. So if any attendees, and we really do encourage participation, if you'd like to provide any information, you can just hop in and say hello. Tell us who you are right now. That'd be great. Tell us some of your interests. I'd love to, I can't see the attendees right now, but I'd love to hear from them. So if you want to pop into the Q&A and just say a little hello, and I'll greet you. And then that way we can get used to using that Q&A tab. So you can write any questions you like during talks, and then we're not going to look at them until after the talk. I will keep the chat open, which is for panelists, just to make sure that everything's working from a technology standpoint. But otherwise, we'll be using the Q&A for all communication, and then I'll be moderating the Q&A tab, and we'll be answering your questions, and then we can use that to communicate with each other. I ask all panelists to not interrupt any presenters, any other panelists while they're speaking, of course. And I also want panelists to know that I will be keeping track of time. So I'll send you a private chat when there's about 2 minutes left. One thing we really want to do is make sure that we start and end on the half hour and on the hour, because I know some people are going to be coming in and out of the conference today, and that's okay, right? That's normal. So so some people are expecting for their time to be on the hour or again on the half hour, and we're going to need to stick with that time schedule. So just to make sure, that's the only reason I'm kind of going to be policing the time for us today. So I apologize in advance. And again, if I'm not going to stop you once I give you a warning that you have 2 minutes left. So, and I tend to go over, so you can just do the same for me, okay? I'll have Clyde kind of wave at me when I'm going over. So if he's around again, he's on California time. So again, I'd like to just stick with the time schedule, and our goal is to start a conversation. So I'd like to just, as we're waiting for the 10:30 time, I haven't heard from any attendees yet on the chat room. Please, please feel free to send those my way and introduce yourself. And maybe I'll continue the chat with Clyde since we're starting our conversation. I don't want to give away, I'm dying to know about your new approaches to conflict resolution, but I don't want to take away any of your thunder from the talk. So Clyde, where were we earlier? We were talking about what, victim offender dialogues, right? Have you done any work on that?
No, no. Well, yes and no. I've done some work with the Hutus and Tutsis. Uh, I've been to over 80 nations in my travels around the world, so I've seen different kinds of conflicts, and it's just amazing, Dr. Erik. The one thing I've learned is this: is one thing people don't know what they don't know. And until we're able to help them understand different things about each other, that's one of the big conflicts I see in the world. People don't know what they don't know. And when dealing with the Hutus and Tutsis, the actual victims of some of those atrocities was even one guy where an actual husband chopped his wife's head off because she was another tribe, and that's how deep the tribal lines go in things. And it's just really opened your eyes to a whole nother perspective of wow, of how thick tribal lines go, as opposed at times to the value of humanity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. On the other end, right, we can praise the Rwandans for victim offender dialogues,
Yes.
for sitting in a dialogue with your neighbor who killed your parents and just served a 10-year, 5-year prison term and came back to live next door to you. Right? There's so much
Absolutely.
humanity. So I agree with you about the how deep the tribal lines go. But from a positive side, that I've
Yes.
seen some documented where the antelope. I can't remember the title of that one documentary, but yeah, I've seen some conversations, and that takes a lot. That takes a lot of character to engage in a dialogue with someone who committed those atrocities to your family, and then they're going to be your neighbor.
Your neighbor again.
And then there's some programs where people are planting gardens together and developing relationships. So that's so powerful.
Dr. Erik, and one of the things that I've seen in the negotiations is when at the end both people are weeping. Both people are weeping, and I've seen some phenomenal healing processes take place out of good dialogue. It just opened up everything. So I mean, I'm so excited for this conversation to be starting, because these conversations, we have to have them, because really everything starts with dialogue. Uh, good good dialogue is the vehicle to help us change everything.
Yeah, I agree. Full disclosure, not just both people, we all parties, because I'm a big crier. So when I facilitate the dialogues, I bring the Kleenex for me and I put them on the table and I say, "You're welcome to use these, but I guarantee I'll hit them first." And yeah, I get so moved in the dialogues, and oh yeah, I'm a gusher. I go quick. Good to get it out of the way too, right? So
Yeah. This is exciting, Erik. This is exciting.
I just had to have my full disclosure. I would like to thank, I would assume that's Miller Martin. Could that be Martin Miller? No, it's Miller Martin. Hi, Miller. Thank you so much for being here. Miller's an attendee who took advantage of my request to contribute to the chat room. Second year student at SLCC and part of the honors program. Cool. Well, Miller, if you ever need any resources for any conflict resolution related projects, we have a great honors program here. And if you want to work with different faculty, I'd be happy to lend you an ear and listen to any of your ideas on any of the topics that I'm discussing today. And so, yeah, you said Miller said he's hoping to expand some understanding about conflict resolution. I think we should be getting there. If not, then I can spend my whole Q&A talking about it if you'd like. And my specialties are mediation, facilitating victim offender dialogues, as I mentioned. I also facilitate community circles, restorative circles for community reintegration, and a variety of work, and also with local youth organizations. So thank you, Miller. You're welcome. Thank you for. I'm enjoying answering your comments. So Clyde, I'm not asking you what caused the Rwandan genocide. I'm not going to put that on you, right? But there was a law that Belgium passed in the 50s that when I look at like the timeline, and I haven't looked at this for a couple of years, but there's this one, I mean, there was the propaganda, there was the hate, there was the rhetoric, there was the taking over the radio waves, and there's access to weaponry, right? And there's the cheap machetes that were being smuggled in. There's a lot of factors, but there was this one policy, right, that really divided the Hutus and the Tutsis that Belgium enacted. I think it was in the 50s. Have you, is that, am I on target there? Or is
Yeah,
that...
yeah. It's, you know, it's amazing how I've learned something in my travels that tradition and policy is the key to everything. It's the key, because what it does, at times it can talk you out of what you've seen. It can talk you out of your mind. I go, no, my eyes have seen this. So Dr. Erik, I've seen a lot of stuff practically. I've been on the ground where the reality is strong, and I just, it's amazing how in like many countries, everyone doesn't have access to all the information. Like in some of these countries, they have 5% electric, 5% electric in the whole country. So the information travels slow, and everyone doesn't have access to information. So what happens when you don't have information, man, it blinds you to the realities of what's going on. And see, people are getting information, and it's so limiting because of their experience and what they've heard information wise.
Yeah, that tradition can allow us to pass bad policies or accept bad policies, right?
Oh.
It's always been that way. Or why not have that? It seems like it's going to benefit the class who's already been benefited. Yeah. So
exactly. And when you understand the institutions that actually built the constitution, that helped build the constitution of these countries, the institutions have basically factually caste systems, that where people are functioning in different caste areas, caste mindsets. So even if you win, you're still in the same caste.
Yeah.
So all these are things that we have to really learn how to address if we're going to really get to the end result of a lot of issues of the world today.
Yeah. You know, when we talked about that communication and the amounts of information, I couldn't help thinking maybe I'm just helping drop in a resource for Miller to look at. But I've worked a little bit with Gene Sharp's information, and you think about Gene Sharp's in the Albert Einstein Institute, and you think about the 198 methods of nonviolent action, right? And you think about how that information is available to us as peace and conflict studies practitioners, and me as a pracademic. I won't drop that word too many more times, right? But I had to drop that one. So yeah, I think about Gene Sharp's work, and I was fortunate enough to work with Jamila Rakib, and that's a really great resource for ways for us to improve on that communication. So yeah, I was dropping that for Miller. And if anyone hasn't worked with any of Gene Sharp's materials, a lot of his texts are available for free online through the Albert Einstein Institute. And super important. He just passed away, I think, within the last 5 years, but that's been really influential to me to work with Gene Sharp, and just how to overthrow a dictator, right? He's super involved. So really interesting.
Really good. It's really good.
Well, we're just about to get started. We got 1 minute left, so I'll let you rest your voice for a second.
Okay.
Sir Clyde, and then I'll give my intro, and then we'll let you get going.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, there we go at the 10:30 mark. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And we're going to get started. We have 7 present panelists today, and we're going to start with number 1, Sir Clyde Rivers. And I already like him. I've known him for 10 minutes, and I'm having a really good time talking to him about justice, peace, and conflict studies. So the title of Sir Rivers' presentation is New Approaches on Conflict Resolution. And just give you a quick bio here. Sir Clyde Rivers is the global leader of the world civility movement, teaching people to value the contributions of others. He is the founder and president of I Change Nations, the world's largest culture of honor network in the world. I'm very interested in hearing about all of these, so I'm going to fill up the Q&A if he doesn't address them in his talk. Dr. Rivers is also the first recipient of the Danny K. Davis Congressional Peace Prize Award, presented by Congressman Danny K. Davis from Illinois. He is the Global Board Chairman and Representative to the United Nations for the Organization of Poverty, Alleviation, and Development based in Stockholm, Sweden. So thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Erik.
I meant that literally when I said sir. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Erik. Let me give you a little background about what I do and who I am. I'm Dr. Clyde Rivers. I'm the founder of I Change Nations. It's the world's largest culture of honor organization in the world. And I've personally been to over 80 nations in the world, and I've seen firsthand what takes place in like conflicts. I've been in countries that were pre-Civil War. I've been in countries that were in the midst of a civil war, and I've been in countries that have come out of the wars. So I have the ability to speak to things from a practical grassroots practicality of issues in like conflict resolution. So in my travels around the world, there's some things that I've seen. So I wrote a book called When Histories Collide. It's a simple read. It's a real simple read. And what I discovered in conflict is I discovered that everyone's historical experience is their truth. So what happens in conflict that I've seen in the work that I do, I've seen individuals, their histories collide. What is that? That's my real life experience is this. The other individual's history is their truth, and it's not my truth. So at times, truths are, both people are telling the truth of what they're up against, how they feel. So what happens at that point, we have an historical collision. And this is where the issue happens. When you negate my truth, now we have a problem. So I've watched around the world, I've watched histories collide. And I said, wait. So what I did is I put together a strategy, and it's when histories collide dialogue. And what I teach people is, hey, if we're gonna have a chance to move forward, and I look at everything so practically, if we're gonna have a chance to move forward, we need to make sure every individual has a right to bring their contribution to the discussion. So what takes place as we teach when histories collide, we say, great, look, as you come to the table of dialogue, this individual is gonna speak his truth from his history. Now, his truth is not wrong to him. So what happens as he speaks, you have to open your mind and ears to hear his truth. That's his reality, and it may not be your reality. So what happens is his reality is his truth. Your reality is your truth. Now, after this one speaks, the other person's able to speak their truth. So what happens is this: when they understand the concepts of when histories collide, now in many cases they are disarmed. So now they have hurts, they have challenges, but they're put in a posture of listening. I tell people, when histories are colliding, we have to listen to each other for change. So see, part of the problem that I see in actually conflict is when histories collide, there has to be a new way of listening. Now, as opposed to me listening to win the argument or win my narrative, now I'm adding more information to the equation so that now as we have a move forward strategy, we now have all the information that is needed from each other's truth. So now, Dr. Erik, this is one of the major challenges that I tell people is when it comes to like conflict resolution, the key is everyone has to be in the meeting that talks about what we're going to discuss. Because what I've seen in many nations of the world is they have a group at the top that sets the information narrative for the meeting. Well, one of the big mistakes, if you don't have every voice at the table, private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, and all components of a community, you tend to not touch what needs to be changed. So part of my theory is this: when histories collide, we have to listen for a change. Now, as we listen for a change, that means both parties have been heard and understood, and now we are listening for a change, how to bring change. So this for us has worked in many countries of the world. We actually set them down and we explain, and what happens when they hear the concept of when their histories are colliding, they go, yes, oh, so his truth is his truth now. So now the people aren't as offended as they hear truth from another person's perspective. And as I'm saying here, we don't solve every problem, but what we do, we open a dialogue to where others can be heard. And one of the major challenges is in the world as we see it right now, people that are like setting the agendas have not listened to everyone in the community. So you have to have an open forum to where we are going to meet and talk about the issues, but we have to have every sector of our community needs to be involved in that process. So now, and even the group that's considered the problem needs to be in the equation of the dialogue. Because many times what I've seen is the group at the top sets the meeting agenda, and what happens at the end of the agenda, they say, we had a public forum and we heard the people, but the agenda is already set behind the scenes. So now, as you have every segment of society represented at the table, because when you have these clashes, what it does, or this conflict, it affects the entire community. So we can no longer afford to have two individuals or three at the table saying, okay, guys, we're going to have a meeting over this, and we set the agenda of this, and without the participation of the community as a whole. So one of the big challenges that we have to understand is the actual process of moving forward, because things don't change overnight, but the conversation can change the narrative overnight. And you have to have a real clear objective of what you are like, what you're trying to achieve in the move forward mitigation strategies. Like I was sharing earlier, I've been in negotiations where I have no idea that a person that doesn't have electric in their village is giving their input on an issue. And the issues were things that have never crossed my mind. And you're like, wow. So an individual that may be in a village without electric may have a challenge. Like, let me give you an example. Climate change is creating climate wars, because in some villages, in Africa and other places around the world, when it doesn't rain, the crops don't grow and the actual cattle die. So what happens when that begins to happen, what takes place is this village is now going to move to another village that has the water. But the village that has the water will not let them in. So now you've created climate wars based on the issue of climate. And then this year happened in one country. Then as the water dried up, what took place was then the actual lions went to the water source and they stayed at the water source. So now no one gets water. So see, these are actually conflicts that people don't necessarily understand. The actual that would never be a thought in my mind. So as I go in and hear these things, I have to open my mind for another person's history that I may not know. And that helps so much in the equation. So my conflict resolution model is when histories collide, everyone is telling their truth. So no one's wrong for telling their truth of how they know it. And then at that point, we have to come to the table and say, great, let's factor in every segment of our society or our community so we all have a voice to have our narrative heard. Then after that, when we hear the actual narrative, we start to actually listen for change. As we listen for change, now I'm not in a defensive listening posture. Now I'm open to hear, because what's going to take place will help us all. And so now as we listen for a change, and this is what makes my model effective, we have to come up with a move forward strategy. You know, some people say start with the end vision in mind. I say no. I say start with the next positive step we can make together. So at the end of every one of my negotiations, we have a move forward strategy. And if there's no agreement, we choose to come back and meet again until we find a way forward. And this is working. And again, there has to be a practicality of the reality of what change looks like. Because change in some countries and regions, it can be the best information at the top, but it may take 3 years to get to the village. It may take time. And then to bring the understanding of the issues, when you have a group at the top that has set an agenda, but it doesn't meet the agenda of the community or the people, it looks good on paper, but it creates another conflict. And this is where what I tell people, we in the actual peace work, we built a table with 3 legs. With a table with 3 legs, it can stand until pressure comes on the 4th leg. We have war, peace, reconciliation. War, peace, reconciliation. Those are the actual 3 legs. The actual 4th leg that'll make that table stand is civility. Teaching people how to treat each other with kindness and respect. So this is a component that we are bringing, that 4th leg to the table of dialogue. And we are seeing some amazing outcomes to this method. We're just saying, hey, because when you can take the offense away, and as I said, it doesn't work 100% of the times, but it works a lot when people are disarmed in the communication. They go, great, I can hear you now. And when you can hear, it makes it much easier to have a move forward strategy. Thank you, Dr. Erik.
All right, thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to your outline and your plan. And we have We have a good 15 minutes for Q&A right now. We've already received 2 questions. So I'd like to read those to you. And then I'd like to follow up and have a conversation about some of your ideas as well. And I've had a chance to read the questions already, and I have an answer to 1 or 2 as well, but I can provide those after you if you'd like. So the first question is, part of what I'm hearing in the approach to when histories collide is that there has to be empathy for the other person. How do you help instill it? Is it simply by sharing someone's story, right? Is it simply by being there and being present and listening to the dialogue? And then, so the first part of the question is, how do you help instill empathy? Is simply by sharing someone's story. And then what challenges do you often face in facilitating dialogue where people are heard? So great
Yeah,
question.
One of the things is I normally have a person with me that has gone through the process in a healthy way, and as actually they can actually share, and the like empathy comes out of their process. So what I came to realize is everyone isn't literate in these negotiations. So at times, it's important to have a good storyteller that can share the emotional experience that took place, and that has created a real empathy in some of our negotiations.
Great.
And what was the other part of that, Dr. Erik?
Right. So I think you said it is by sharing someone's story, but it's also by having someone who's good at telling a story share their experiences. And people are oftentimes moved by hearing those experiences.
Because many times, Dr. Erik, people understand the actual conflicts of the various tribes. Yeah. So when this guy that was in this actual genocide comes out and speaks about it, everyone knows, wow, that was a really bad genocide. That was a horrific time. So for this guy to come and share how at the end of the day, the guy that killed his brother, they're weeping and they're actually holding each other, and they actually realize that they lost, I mean, humanity in it. They lost humanity. So we help people understand that, hey, at the end of your clash, there's another human being that has a family just like you, kids that he loves, with the community that they love. So what we do is we also bring that into the equation a lot. So you hear that a lot. Hey, this is a human being that loves his family, that wants the best for his family. So that helps us too, Dr. Erik.
Definitely. So that's humanity. The latter part of this first question was, what challenges do you often face in facilitating dialogue where people are heard?
Politics. The actual policy end of the grid many times doesn't want to lose the power. So it needs the problem. So at times we face the hard line of this actual tribe. If they lose power because they've done wrong to the other tribe, they actually fear retribution. Right. So they don't want to let go.
Right. It's that sense of safety in the dialogue, but it's the reality of what happens outside of the dialogue.
Absolutely.
That drives. Yeah, I like your experiences. They're so broad. Mine are kind of narrow in the room, right? In the mediation room, yours are big, and you're looking at how is the media going to portray this? How do the sides have to save their face? And once you add that to these dialogues, it gets much more complicated, right? Sound bites. You have to explain what you have to debrief the public on what happened in those closed doors to make sure people are protected there. So that's
exactly
fascinating. That's something I don't have to worry about, right? Mine just goes into a compliance form, right? And then everything else about my dialogues are going to be pretty confidential and protected, and they stay in the room, and I shred my notes. Right? So you're up against a larger scale picture. I'd like to respond to this question as well, just from a smaller scale. Empathy is super important. How do I help instill empathy? So we call something in mediation, we have something called the turning point. And the turning point is really hard to explain. And I've talked to a lot of people about the turning point. What is it? It's when someone's demeanor changes, when they start looking at the other disputant, when they start looking at the offender differently, instead of looking at the facilitator. It's when they're, and this kind of leads into the second question, it's when their body and their mannerisms change, when their physical presence change. And we call it a lot in mediation, we see the turning point when the disputants look at each other and not at the mediator. So empathy is super important.
Really good.
So that's kind of to the first question, right? How do we help instill empathy? I think what Clyde's talking about is just the dialogue. What I really, I like your use of the term truth, right? I didn't like it at first because truth has this correctness embedded in it. And I thought about belief might be better, but to those individuals, it is their truth. It is what defines their system. It is what drives their ideologies. So at first I was listening to your talk, like, well, maybe we need a different word for truth, but then I got to see how its benefits of that truth is what, and then we kind of norm it with human rights, as you said, we kind of anchor it in there. So my response to the latter part of the question, and then Clyde, I'll ask you the second question. My response to the latter, the third part of the first question is, what challenges do you often face in facilitating dialogue where people are heard? So power differentials, right? And for Clyde, those power differentials are much bigger. For me, you want to be an unbiased, neutral, multi-partial facilitator and mediator, and you are confronted with a power differential. That's a huge challenge that I'm confronted with. And then to be neutral, to be multi-partial, to be impartial, then you have to balance out that power in a way that's fair, that maintains your neutrality. Now I know Clyde's work is with the United Nations. United Nations mediators are not neutral, right? They have an agenda. That's to forward the United Nations agenda. So it's really interesting to think about that type of mediation and facilitation. So they are not challenged with that neutrality because they are biased. They want to support human rights. Their boss is the United Nations, who has an agenda, who has a constitution for human rights. So yeah, I'd say empathy would be that turning point. It would be listening. It is through sharing someone's story, and I think Clyde had a really good answer of having someone there who is able to communicate that story well. And then the challenge that I face, right? So I hate to approach it from a negative viewpoint, but I never know if someone's going to be genuine, right? And that's when we think about truth and reconciliation commissions, and we think about amnesty, and we think about accountability, and we never know. Is someone going to just be there and say whatever they need to say because they know they're going to have a reduced sentence? Because they know if they participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, then they won't be held accountable for their sins, for their actions. So that's probably the biggest challenge. And I enter into every dialogue, and I'm not pushing that on the participant. We call it the A word and the F word, apology and forgiveness. And I say, don't use the A word and don't use the F word, because that's not what I want. I want it to be genuine and sincere. I might go back to Clyde's comment on truth. So those are really great questions. And I've spent years thinking through measuring empathy. Right? Like, how do you know it's there? How do you know it's sincere? That's not an easy concept. That could be a great project for one of our SLCC students.
Really good. And then Erica, may I interject another thing?
Please, this is your floor. I'm just kind of giving my 2 cents, but this is all you.
What I've learned is meaning doesn't mean the same for everyone. So we really try to drive home meaning. What we're saying, what does this mean to you, so that we are on the same page in meaning of the question, the meaning. So we have seen times where people speak stuff and it means one thing to them and a whole nother thing. So we spend a lot of time clarifying the meaning of what we're asking.
Right. Yeah, that's as a facilitator, I often say, what does this term mean to you? Will you define this term and explain it to us? Because it could mean something else to me and something else to you. That's a great comment. Thank you. So your second question reads, in my experience, de-escalating of a situation can be swayed drastically by how I stand physically, where I place my hands, and by paying close attention to facial expression. I realize these are conflicts of different sizes, right? However, do you place any importance on nonverbal in your practices?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Absolutely. If you're inviting and you're attentive, people, at the end of the day, we are dealing with like human beings that can feel, that are not just robots. So if we're engaging and inviting and we're looking at them and we're hearing what they say and we're checking for like feedback, that means so much to our conversations. It means so much because at times both parties are watching. So as we take our time with them, the other group knows we'll take our time with them. So that's a real key component that we train our leaders in.
Yeah, and it can backfire too, right? So we model that, we look for it, but we also know that it could be uh, detrimental to individuals. So I was facilitating a dialogue with a youth who was with a police officer who was really nervous, and he had a nervous laughter, and his victim said, "Are you laughing at me? Right? Why are you laughing?" Like she was really upset and offended by that. And it was just kind of rolling eyes. But for
Really
him,
good.
it was this nervousness. So I actually called a stop to the dialogue. I met with the parties individually. I asked the youth if he was nervous. And he said, "Yeah, I'm really, really nervous." And then I was able to communicate with the victim that this is just a nervousness that is affecting it. So that's a little more beyond nonverbal, right? But still, we can see those cues. We can see how they could be misinterpreted, and we can address that. So it's really fascinating.
That's really good.
Have you had do you have any examples, Clyde, about any nonverbal cues or any stories where someone's kind of misinterpreted someone?
Yeah, one I was in a country where and I forget the exact but a word for this other person meant love, but for the other one it meant you were stupid. So the person used the word, and the other individual said, "This guy he just called me stupid." And it was a play on a tribal dialect. So there's so much stuff that we just again as a facilitator, we are open to actually keep the actual lanes of communication as positive as we can. But at times when you're talking tribal stuff around the world, it creates so that created a lot of conflict for us. I am not dumb. I
Yeah,
am this. Why'd you call me that? And he goes,
that's
"Clyde,
great.
this means this in my language."
Yeah, I think in Farsi, mediator translates to meddler, someone who interferes with your problems. And there were some U.S. diplomats there. I think this was during the Iran hostage crisis. And they're like, "Don't worry, we will call a mediator to mediate the issue." And in translation, that was a meddler to meddle into your affairs. It was, yeah, a really great example of that miscommunication and those cultural differences and how that could really backfire. And so that leads to us as conflict resolvers to be aware of those cultural differences, be aware of that terminology, and kind of goes back to your point, Clyde, about having someone on hand who knows the culture. As John Dewey would say, they know where the shoe pinches, right, within
Yeah.
that organization, and they can help us not make those mistakes of using
Yes.
wrong language and saying meddler for me. Fun. A final thought. I know we just have one more minute, but this might help the questions from one of the audience members. I think about transformative mediation offers us two ideas as we facilitate these dialogues. And it's not a settlement driven approach, and it's not settlement bias, but it's empowerment and recognition. And if we can instill those, and there is that empathy and that recognition component in response to our question, right? So if we can focus not on settlement, but how can we measure empowerment and recognition amongst the members of the dialogue, then that's something we can do better at. And we do have some measurement tools for empowerment and recognition. I think the United States Postal Service has done the most formal assessment of transformative mediation through their redress program. And that's really fascinating. So if you're interested in any materials on how to measure empowerment and recognition, I have access to some of those. Great, well, it's 11 o'clock. Clyde, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. I really enjoyed your talk. I look forward to taking a look at When Histories Collide. I'll order a copy from my library here.
Man, thank you so much. And I'm going to stick around and watch the other.
Excellent, thank you. And we got a thanks to the both of us for taking the time to answer questions. So
thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Excellent. Well, we have our new speaker here is Chris Macias. Welcome, Chris. Chris's presentation is entitled Completing the Dream. And Chris is the director of the Dream Center at the University of Utah. So we have 3 people from 3 different institutions so far and 3 different states. So that's always great for starting of our conversation. That's where Chris works with undocumented students, mixed status folks, and their allies. He holds a bachelor's degree in human development and family studies and a master's degree in education, culture, and society, where he focused on lowrider pedagogy. I think that's really cool. I was reading over your bio, and I just have a little bit of exposure to lowrider culture, but not lowrider pedagogy, so I'm looking forward to hearing about that. And he's also a foreign language and area studies fellow with a focus on Latin America. Chris is also co-chair of the local Chicana Chicano Scholarship Fund and member of the local autonomous chapter of the Brown Berets, which I know very little about. I'd love to hear about that as well. And his personal life, it's nice to have a bio. You have good work life, you're modeling good work-life balance, Chris, because your bio talks about life. Thank you. I don't do that. I don't model good work-life balance. In his personal life, he enjoys watching movies, training, Capiero, sorry about that, and cruising in his 67 Impala on the weekends. Chris speaks Spanish and Portuguese. Am I pronouncing Freire right? I always fight with people about how to pronounce Paulo Freire's last name. I spoke to a friend who's fluent in Portuguese, and he said, yes, it's Freire, but you might have a different take on that, and enjoys spending time with his wife and 2 sons. So after you answer my Freire pronunciation question, the floor is all yours. Looks like you're unmuted now, Chris.
Hello, testing 1, 2.
Check. That worked.
Okay, oh good. I had to switch between microphones. I apologize for that. I thought
you're on.
But yes, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate that introduction. It's funny you mentioned that. I mentioned like work-life balance and whatnot, just because parts of that are all over the place. And I believe it was Dr. Anthony Nocella who actually put it together. So thank you for that bio. And the way that I say it, according to the northern Brazilians where I learned Portuguese from, is freire. So it's still a little bit different than the pronunciation you were presenting. But you know what? I don't actually know. So I'm going to stick with what
I don't think I could pull that off. I don't think I can do that accent early on, but thank you for answering my question.
For sure. But yeah, so to be completely honest with all of you, first of all, again, thank you for having me here, right? But to be completely honest with everybody, I'm not as familiar with the overall concept of this conference. I do know the theme, I know the title. I mean, I do a lot of work in the community, and thus I was invited to come and speak a little bit. Though normally I'm asked to come talk about some of my research, which is again, lowrider studies, which is something that we're doing together, right? Which is kind of how do we view history, how do we view art and culture and expression, and how do we view dismantling white supremacy and things like that through the lens of lowriding. What does that actually mean for folks, right? So that's something I'm interested in talking about. However, I was asked today to more talk about my professional life and my work a little bit. So I'm hoping that what I talk about today is going to be just a glimpse into what I do in terms of working with undocumented students and working for that community, but also in how we're trying to connect that to the larger world of activism, the larger world of policy change and law and whatnot. So I'm just a small chapter in the larger book, if you will, right? In the larger encyclopedia. So once again, yeah, thank you all for having me here. So yeah, I'm just gonna jump right into that, just tell you about the work that I do and try to connect it into everything. So for me, Once again, my name is Chris Macias. I serve as a director of the Dream Center. The Dream Center works with, like I said, undocumented folks or mixed status families. When I say mixed status, that means people who are in every sort of version of citizenship or residency or lack of in this country, right? So that could mean young folks who are here undocumented without the DACA program, without temporary protected status, without a path to residency whatsoever, or those who are applying for a green card or residency, or those who are citizens of this country, but their parents were immigrants who brought them here. And so the statuses are all mixed all over the place. And so we have to find out what students, I say students because of primarily what I work with, but what this population needs and how we can actually connect them. And I find that my work is very much case by case, right? Even though I'm trying to say, well, this state law applies to you, or this policy applies to you, or this national decision applies to you, but how does it actually affect your personal life? Well, that's on a case-by-case basis. Just this morning, it was announced, Supreme Court made a decision for somebody from Michigan who's an undocumented immigrant who came here as a young child, did not qualify for any of the protected statuses that were offered by the government at the time during the Obama administration. And the Supreme Court just ruled that this person can stay in this country because they had an order for deportation, but because the ICE agency did not do some paperwork correctly, he's now able to stay. And it was kind of surprising because on a very minimal wording for paperwork, we now have people who can qualify to stay here, be relieved from deportation based on ICE protocol. And that was just announced this morning, and I was super excited to share that with folks. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means overall, because like I said, it's only been a couple hours, but I'm excited for the prospects of that, what it could mean for people to say, if I'm a student or if I'm working, and based on your protocols and your policy, I can still remain here, right? So it's kind of saying the government effed up, not me. So I think it's really cool that the Supreme Court actually voted that way. But what I'm going to do today is actually center some of the voices of the people that I work with. I'm going to read you direct quotes from them, and then from there, share a little bit about the work that we do and what policies we're trying to change and what we're trying to do overall based on their voices. So I should be able to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so that was the introduction. And last thing I want to add though is even though I'm working in a student affairs setting and I'm working as a professional, quote unquote, on the university campus, my background is access to education, access to resources, access to community involvement, engagement. And I come from an activist background as well. I mean, you mentioned in my bio, the Brown Berets, which is an organization that seeks essentially kind of what conference is about, right? Peace and justice for our communities. And we have kind of a 10-point program. We're modeled a lot after the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s, which came about in the same era, but said we need to focus some of our like Chicanx, Mexican American type issues, and then expand it from there for other Latinx communities, right? So that's my background a little bit. That's where I come from, and that's why I thought undocumented folks need to also have someone in their corner, if you will. So again, direct quotes from students, some of their realities, and then what we're doing from there. So this particular student says, earlier this year, I had to go to the financial aid office. All right, this is who processes their paperwork for tuition and whatnot. But my reimbursement was placed on hold because they assumed my status as an international student. They explained to them they're non-international because they pay in-state tuition due to HB 144, which in the state of Utah is a policy that allows folks whose parents pay taxes to continue paying in-state tuition. Otherwise, they would qualify as an international student and pay out of state. Right? So in this case, because their parents pay taxes, because they went to a Utah high school here where I'm at, they qualify for this House bill, allowing them to reduce their tuition. But this person did not understand their concern, and therefore we're not able to help them. They're saying it's difficult to navigate a system that makes it, and it's even more frustrating when staff does not know the policies in place that affect students with or without DACA. DACA, again, is a deferred action for childhood arrivals. This is something that was in place in 2012 during the Obama administration to say that young individuals who were brought here by their parents and essentially went to school here, studied here, can qualify for protected status. And what that means is that as long as they have this work permit and they're renewing it every 2 years, they are relieved from deportation. So they cannot be sent to whatever country they originally came from, right? Excuse me. So, but this particular quote though, what this is saying is that people don't understand basic policies. Undocumented students in the state of Utah and pretty much everywhere in this country as well cannot qualify for federal financial aid, which is the way that most of us got assistance in paying for tuition. Those of us that come from low-income backgrounds and things like that. So when someone doesn't understand that at a very basic level, it's very frustrating, not only for the students, but for us, because then I have to go back and retrain the financial aid folks on how to do financial aid, right? And they're kind of used to a system where they check a box and move it on, check another box and move it on. But in this case, it's not just about checking the box, it's about doing a whole different setup. So I actually had to go to the financial aid office locally at my institution and say, we need to hire somebody who I can train specifically on this, which eventually that ended up happening. And we now have folks in there who know exactly what to do with HB 144, DACA, social security numbers or lack of social security numbers. But not only that, now we have this streamlined training at this institution, which I'm again at the University of Utah, but also I was able to present it to the Utah System of Higher Education, which is an organization now that meets with all of the public schools in the state of Utah to say this streamlined process needs to be applied to all our institutions, because state law and national policy are the same thing for every student. Why do we have to do this individually and differently at each school, right? So it is now a statewide effort that we're doing this, and we're trying to make it automatic. When a student applies to a university and they do not get accepted because of their status, we're trying to make it that automatically they're sent HB 144 paperwork so that they can fill that out and say, no, I still qualify, right? One of the main things that I do all the time, and it's kind of sad that I have to, but I go out to the community and I tell folks, even as undocumented persons, you absolutely have the right to education. And in this country, because they don't have the right to work, they also assume they cannot go to school, or they're told they cannot go to school. And to me, that's very saddening, because I do believe in education. And I know that some of the folks in this room virtually, we have our quarrels with the educational system and how it works and who has access and all of that. And that's a different conversation that I definitely am a part of and want to have. But in this case, at least having the access to something is going to provide them relief overall for the status, right? So that's one thing. So I wanted to explain that a little bit. Another, this student is talking about invisibility. They say I don't see the inclusion of undocumented students in campus-wide events or our accomplishments highlighted, for example, in a college newspaper, social media, online websites, et cetera, et cetera. So what this means is that people on our universities or in our colleges simply do not know that this population even exists. When we talk about undocumented folks at the national level, we hear Supreme Court making decisions, and we hear about the DACA program, and we hear this fight for immigration reform, you know, now that the current president is talking about, which, by the way, doesn't mean anything. It's just an affirmation that the conversation is happening. But people say, well, they don't know that we're even here. And then once we actually acknowledge that folks are here, what can we do about it? Or how many people are here? Or what's the goal, right? And so there's this whole conversation about how do we show this population without actually pointing out, hey, this student, that person, this parent, they're undocumented, because we don't want to do that either. That creates a sense of fear for that community, right? We want to show that we need these resources, include them wherever you're at, regardless of your department, regardless of your office, your organization, just so that you know this population does exist. And in Utah, the numbers are actually higher than most people think, right? So something that we're trying to do to help resolve that, and I apologize, there's a bunch of messages coming through. I thought I stopped it, so I don't know if you can hear some beeping. My apologies. So one of the things we're trying to do is create some sort of what I'm calling a dreamer stamp, but it's still in the works of a title because that's not a good title. But basically what that means is when there's an event, whether it's on our campus or in the community or any of these public institutions in the state of Utah, we're trying to show that even if the event has nothing to do with undocumented folks, we want them to show that there's some kind of thing saying you are welcome here. We recognize that you have a certain need. We're not going to be asking for identification. We're not going to be asking you for any sort of track record of who you are, except, I mean, unless a registration for the event or something like that, but just to make it so it's clear that they are welcome there, right? And then we can also say students who are documented provided this and provided, aided us in these things, right? Especially when it comes to research. The University of Utah is a research one institution, which is where we get most of our funding from all these things. And we have a lot of students who are immigrants contributing to that research. And one of the things we're trying to change is again, the giving them credit for that, the visibility of it. And then finally, switching the language overall. We hear a lot of people saying, oh, University of Utah researchers found X, or Utah researchers found this, or even out of the country, right? We might say Japanese researchers or German researchers collaborated with us to find this. But the reality is we want to switch it around to say researchers in Germany, because that way, when we switch basic language like that, it includes folks who may or may not be from that nationality or from that country right here on our own campus, right? So I hope in a roundabout way that kind of makes sense. So that's one of the things we're trying to change overall. And then in terms of allyship, another student says, one of the barriers I've encountered in the classroom is not knowing whether or not I'm in a safe space to share my experiences. What has helped this year has been undocumented student support, syllabus, statement that professors can add. So this is a smaller thing. It's more local to the University of Utah, but we in the Dream Center help create student support syllabus statement. So just like a lot of universities now have to add like an ADA statement to say, right, American Disabilities Act, if you require accommodations, come talk to the professor, we will accommodate you. You do not have to disclose your disability. You simply have to let us know that you need an accommodation. What we want to do was something very similar, to say there might be undocumented students in this class, so we have to recognize that when we talk about all these legal issues going on in the country, immigration and the stupid wall, like all that kind of dumb stuff, right? What kind of conversation are we having? And we want to humanize these individuals. It's not just some sort of abstract concept that we're talking about in this country. We're talking about people who might be in your classroom. And this statement has now also been shared with the other institutions. I don't know how they're implementing it just yet. This is something we're working on, but at least for now at the University of Utah, it's something that I think has really, really been helpful. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll just completely shut off mine. It's also my laptop, no problem. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 second because that keeps coming through and I so apologize. I guess I'm popular today. While I do this, are there any questions so far?
We have received no questions from the attendees. Are you going to talk about the stamp? Did you say a stamp?
Yeah, so that was part of the, let me go back. So that's part of the one here where, again, we want to create some sort of visible icon so that people know that they're welcome in certain events or certain places without necessarily having to disclose anything, right? And again, what that means is they've had knowledge about saying we don't ask for documentation, we don't ask for registration, we don't ask for identification. It's simply an open space. And that might seem pretty simple for most places. You know, if you go to a store, if you go to a campus department or something like that, you shouldn't have to ask for those things, right? But once it's explicitly stated, it's now in people's mind to include this community, right? So that's kind of the point overall. So this one I just talked about. So another student here is talking about participation overall, and not just in school, but in the community, right? So I wish I could be able to participate in activities. In some situations, it feels like a valid immigration status is needed, which has kept me from participating in research, conferences, alternative breaks, etc. So again, coming from a research institution, we have opportunities not only to bring in people from different countries, but also to send them abroad to do just that research. A little bit different than a regular study abroad program, but also conferences in different parts of the country and alternative breaks. Alternative breaks, for those who aren't familiar, is during spring break, many schools offer service learning opportunities where they take them either somewhere else in the country or a different country altogether to provide service. Again, we have some issues with, you know, volunteerism and some issues with intrusive practices and things like that. But at the very minimum, the service opportunity is something that's afforded to students in order to better their whole academic experience, right? And so the students that I work with in the communities that we serve simply cannot participate in these things. And so that's something else we're trying to change. How do we provide equitable access, fair access to these students to still get some sort of credit in that sense, and also be able to offer it to them without putting them in danger, right? So when it comes to research, that one is a little bit easier because, again, we can bring folks into us to help do that research instead of having to send them elsewhere. And then we also provide general maps of where it might be okay for students to go and where not. For example, we have a partnership with the University of Arizona where we do, you know, different conferences and we send students in a yearly thing. But a lot of our students are fearful to go to Southern Arizona because that's heavy ICE presence, heavy border patrol. And they're simply saying if we're ever stopped at a checkpoint, they may or not be returning home. And that instills a sense of fear, which is kind of their point, but it's something we're trying to fight, right? So like I said, we have a partnership with different universities as well, so that when we connect them there, they know exactly where to go, how to do it, how to be as safe as possible. As far as the alternative breaks, instead of going somewhere now, we partnered with different folks. There's part of in my bio that we talked about the Center for Latin American Studies, which they have been coordinating with different people in different countries. Right now, Latin American Studies is working with South American folks to teach language. And what they've done, and especially now during this pandemic, virtually they've been able to connect with different folks to teach, to work, and to kind of have that experience of going somewhere and doing those activities, but virtually while they're still here. And we're trying to expand that beyond just the pandemic needs, right? So it's something that's offered as a whole. And so again, it's not just about the University of Utah, what we're doing on this campus, but it's about providing the opportunities overall for the communities that we serve, overall for immigrants and undocumented folks, at least for now in the state of Utah, but trying to take these models elsewhere. I've also been meeting with people in different states that are interested in starting centers similar to the one we have here. And they're curious, how do you do it? How do I get funding? How do I make this work, right? I just met like 2 weeks ago with somebody in Ohio who says, we have a huge immigrant population here. We need to get them to school and we need to get these resources for them. And so we're having these conversations starting to be more at the national level. And I'm grateful to be able to connect with folks virtually to make this happen. Let's see. See something in the chat here. Let me just quickly. Well, looks like I can't see the chat while I'm sharing. So if there's something I need to know, please let me know.
It's been 21 minutes. So if you can wrap it up within about 2, that'll give us 8 minutes for question and answer.
Perfect. I can do that. I only have like 2 more slides anyway, so I can do it. So this student I just met with a couple of days ago, and they said, I can benefit from the Dream Center now because they're able to get some scholarships. I'm able to provide them with connections to resources and even some legal advice and things like that. But then he says, I feel like my degree is worthless after I graduate. What am I supposed to do? I had a student right here crying, literally saying, I'm going to graduate next year and I'm already thinking that my degree is useless, right? And that's a terrible reality that a lot of the folks we work with have to deal with, because while they're in school, yes, they have the right to go to school, but if they don't never get that work permit, what are they supposed to do with their degree? So what we've been doing here is saying, hey, University of Utah, and hey, universities in the state of Utah, these folks that are graduating are your alumni. Just like you have alumni associations and you have fraternities and you have all these groups connecting people to all these networks of companies and work and job outlook, why can't we do that here? Can you take care of your own alumni, right? And I literally said that to some of the alumni association here, like, can you do this, right? I know they have funding for certain things. Maybe they're not creating jobs, but what are they doing to take care of them overall, creating a pipeline into the world of the workforce, right? And again, it may not necessarily be a job right away, but it might be connecting them to research opportunities where they can still get funding for that to at least fund themselves in the meantime. So a lot of what I do essentially is finding loopholes, which I feel like I'm now getting really good at, right? What does a policy say? But what does a policy not say is my job, is how I describe it. These last couple here are pretty similar, but they're basically saying there's a lot going on and our life depends on politics and politicians. It's really hard to explain everything that we're doing overall. And so something that I like to always say that I do is that I take the burden of interpreting policy and law for students so that I can tell them, here's how it affects you, here's what you need to know, and here's how we're going to help you from this point on, right? Everything that I do is very student-centered and very family-centered. I take from them, just like this presentation, direct quotes, or I take their experiences, and then I try to present policy change, right? And then I try to present curriculum building overall to create not only an environment where we're saying, yeah, we help students get you to the classroom, but we're saying we're creating community engagement, we're creating activists, and we're creating empowerment for the students that we serve. So just a quick glimpse into what I do, into how the process works for creating these things. And I really appreciate you all listening to a little bit of that. So thank you all very much. And yeah, I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really enjoyed your talk. We have no questions yet from the attendees, but I'd like to follow through with a couple of points if you don't mind. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for your content. I really want to thank you for centering voices, right? For revolving your presentation around people's voices. And I think that's super powerful. And I also want to thank you for both using and explaining your use of the term mixed status folks. I think that that's super important for us to have that in our vocabulary as we continue with our work. I'm curious in a couple things. Seeing how there is a dream center at the University of Utah, I think I've kind of answered my question about your institutional support and how the president of the university has come out in support of Dreamers. I would assume it's very positive if you have the Dream Center, right? So that kind of answered my question.
Well, it is now.
Okay.
But the beginning and the history of this center was not exactly like that. The university never said we need to create a Dream Center. It was students, and I'll give credit to them who said, "Hey, we need a voice. We need an advocate." You know, and so there was a couple years long fight to make it happen. And so now that it's here, and now that we're providing data and things like that, now they're happy to have us.
Right. Well, that's how it works, right? They're not going to create it. We have to create it for them, and then we have to prove it works, right? It's that measurement concept I was talking about earlier. So, well, that's even better. Knowing that you guys, the students, and you guys built it from the ground up, that's even better. So that's super cool. I was going to talk about policy, but I kind of want to follow through with something you said in the end. And if you're going to be around for my talk, which is following yours, we want to write a grant for building up our programs for restorative justice and peace and conflict studies. And I started thinking about pedagogy and curriculum building, right, which is what you kind of ended on. And at my institution, 50% of the student population is Native Americans. And we have invested a decent amount of money, grant funded, into indigenizing, which I'm not too fond of that word, but that's what we use, indigenizing our syllabi. And what have you done, if anything, or what would you like to do about curriculum building and helping faculty create dream-centered, I don't know if that's the right word, mixed status folk-centered curriculum? What do you, that seems like it's in your wheelhouse. That's something I'd love to talk about at any time, but do you guys have any like curriculum design packets or any syllabi that are modeled for mixed status folks?
Yeah, well, one of the things I mentioned was that syllabus statement, which again is just kind of an add-on to the syllabus. It's not actually incorporating into the whole thing for now, right? It's kind of step one, but it is definitely something we want to do. But the very first thing that I do when I talk to faculty is to say, can we first just humanize these folks, right? Because like I said, it's always an abstract idea. It's always immigration and 600,000 DACA recipients and what that means. And you hear in the media, and it's just kind of this convoluted conversation that doesn't really humanize who these people are, right? Or who we all are, I should say. And so I think that's the first thing, is to say, when we talk about history, when we talk about the history of immigration particularly, we're talking about something that's still going on right now. All right, so you can go back and talk about all these things and what's going on and why we have an idea for a wall and why deportation even happens and why ICE was created in the first place. But then we can talk about this is how it still affects students now, or not just students, but the population as a whole, right? This is what's going on. So I think that first humanizing element has to be there in order to be able to have these more nuanced conversations, right? And so we haven't quite got to that part, unfortunately, yet. Like, to use your word, right, indigenizing the classroom. But it's definitely something that is all interconnected, and we definitely want to do.
Cool. Well, thank you I couldn't find the right verb, and you helped me there with it. It's that humanizing, right? So that'd be really interesting to work on. I'd be happy to share some of our materials, right? I think it's the voices we use, right? It's obviously it's the text we choose, not just relying on the canon. It's the values, the means of delivery, right? We don't just value published academic works. We give voice to people who aren't fortunate enough to be able to publish those. Those are the readings we choose. I went through some of my samples for how to write a paper, and I made sure all of my resources, all of the people in my sample references lists were people of color, right? So just trying to expand that is one step. And then we also looked at individual practices in our classrooms. How can we give voice to different people? And then, yeah, another strategy I've used has been research methods. I think research methodology is a really fascinating place to go to if you want to continue this conversation later, is how can we provide, action research versus empirical research? How can we provide participatory action research? How can we provide faculty with different methodologies? And how can we give students those skills to choose those methodologies when they have a choice? So yeah, fun conversation to have.
Yeah.
We're interested. And again, I've done a couple indigenizing of my syllabi trainings, and I'd be happy to discuss those with you.
No, I'm very familiar with participatory action research, and how that works. And again, just from my own background, once I got to the university, especially to a postgraduate degree, when they were saying, oh, participatory action research, and then is not only studying that group, but then doing work with the community and whatnot. And I thought, okay, so that's what I've been doing. That's what it's called. And that took me a long time to kind of connect academia to activism, but I feel like we're striking a balance at least over here. So.
Excellent. Well, we're at the 11:30 mark, so I just want to thank you very much for your contributions, both to this conference and to your community. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'll stick around for a few minutes so I can still answer other questions. And I also put my contact information and social medias in the chat for everybody to see. So again, thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. Well, now I'm up. Let me pull up my screen and get things started. Am I showing my full presentation, or do you guys see the notes slide? Oh, thank you, Will. That's what I was seeing on this screen. Okay, I appreciate it. How's that, Will? Will, am I showing my presentation slide now?
I can see it.
Is it my notes or just the presentation?
It's the presentation, Eric, but it's very small. If you could go back and share as you were before in the presentation view, and then I'll walk you through how to get that into full screen.
Okay, I'm not asking it to show my notes slide, but thank you. Sorry about that. Well, you're like the man behind the curtain, right? When you show up. I love it. Okay, I have us on share screen.
Okay, and then at the very top under view, or excuse me, slideshow. Well, now this works. Right here is fine. In the there's the three dots right below the slide. It's got like the pen. Yeah, click on that, and then say hide presenter view.
Thank you.
And then go ahead and share again. See if this works. Huh.
I have two screens working right now.
Oh, that might be it. Hey, at the top, Eric, instead under slideshow, the tab in the ribbon slideshow, and then there's a checkbox that says use presenter view over to the right there. Yep, go ahead and check that. Now go ahead and go back into slideshow. I'm still not seeing that in full screen.
All right, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn off my other screen. And how's that?
That is perfect. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that, guys. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Erik Juergensmeyer, and I'm here to present today on the collaborative that Dr. Nocella and I are interested in establishing, and hoping that the participants of today's conversation are interested in joining with us. So our goal right now, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to continue the conversation. And what we intend to do is continue thinking about restorative practices, continue thinking about opportunities for justice, and peace and conflict studies in our region. And I'd like to add in California here. I don't want to exclude Clyde just by mentioning the Southwest. And I told him I'd do that this morning. So what I'd like to do right now is establish my framework for the grant that we're going to write this summer, and encourage you guys to both contribute to my ideas and also think about how your work can contribute to my framework. So since I'm not reading my own bio here, I'll just give you a little bit of a background about myself. I am the Peace and Conflict Studies Coordinator here at Fort Lewis College in lovely Durango, Colorado, where I'm also a professor of English with a specialization in rhetoric. And that's where I mentioned to Clyde about his use of the term truth. And I was, of course, interested in Chris's use of mixed status folks and those centering voices and research methodologies. And I'm also fortunate enough to be a community facilitator here in our community, where I facilitate victim offender dialogues and community circles and restorative circles, and I also mediate disputes. So again, what I'm here to present on today is an argument for a grant proposal to establish a consortium, to establish a group, and to create resources for what Chris and I were just talking about, right, is curriculum building in the academic setting, or as Brian Miller, my employer, who will be speaking next, is going to talk about, for developing restorative programs in our communities. So the core of my argument is that justice, peace, and conflict studies are manifest in restorative justice practices. And I'll be defining that really loosely in just a second. The field of rhetoric, and especially these rhetorical ecologies and concepts of rhetorical genre studies, can help us build our coalitions. So that's what I'm super interested in establishing. And then I'll define and give some examples of ecologies, and I'll also define and give examples of genre, which I'm going to make an argument for this particular grant that we're going to be writing. Again, my goal with the grant is to create a collaborative that can focus on restorative justice literacy. And then the end result of that would be to share our work with our stakeholders, strengthen our alliances, and improve restorative practices, or practices of justice, peace, and conflict studies in our community. So to begin, I'm just going to give you a super general definition of restorative justice, right? Working with Howard Zehr, the grandfather of restorative justice, right? So what is restorative justice, right? And you can see this fully restorative black part in the middle of this Venn, and you can look at these mostly restorative, right? And then partly restorative. I'm not excluding any practices. I'd like to expand this list as we continue to dialogue about my proposal. So restorative justice is an approach to achieving justice that involves those who have a stake, right? People to whom harm has been done, people who have caused harm. I apologize in advance for using the terms victim and offender. I kind of default to those, but as we know from Howard Zehr, we want to avoid such terminology, right? And it's this expansion of the circle of stakeholders, which is one of our goals for today. To get to the concept of rhetorical ecology and genre, I'm going to start out with a basic writing lesson, right, on the rhetorical situation and this Lloyd Bitzer's concept. And what we have is this kind of dynamic relationship between the writer, the subject, and the audience, right? And we have to put everything in context. And again, this could go back to talking about Chris's really good work at the Dream Center when we talk about curriculum building. And how we have to consider the subject, the writer, and the audience, and we have to think about everything we do in these regards. So again, simply apply to an activist situation. We take MLK's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and we look at how the author, the text, the audience, the setting, and those purpose all combine to be effective activism. Unfortunately, though, one thing we learn in the discipline of rhetoric is that this became a little bit constraining. So we wanted to expand this concept. So we identified this kind of use of these rhetorical ecologies. And that's a term we use to make a more dynamic understanding of a rhetorical situation. And what we learned is that when developing and advocating for activism, we wanted to understand the more complex relationships between individuals. We wouldn't just look at the speech itself in that one situation. We'd look at this dynamic web of relationships that took place prior to that speech being given. And that's where all of the work truly takes place, which we know participating in this work ourselves. So what we have is all of these temporal and historical and lived fluxes that are influence these, and looking at their trace effects. I think this goes back to Clyde's argument at the beginning of this presentation, of this conference, where he's talking about these histories and these frameworks and these narratives, right? We can't just look at this static situation. So then we understand these rhetorical ecologies, and then we understand how do we capture them. And that becomes my goal here. Several times today I've mentioned measurements and looking at those types of concepts. So how do we capture it? Well, it's not just MLK speech, right? We take all of those multiple mundane texts that take place in a movement, right? And then we need to understand those. And my argument is to capture those and to map those and to include those in our work when we're sharing our work with restorative practices in our communities. So we move beyond the letters and speeches. We focus on the strategy documents, the newsletters, the emails, the memos, and those images of the spaces where protests were planned. This creates a new structure for us, and this is kind of an initial mapping I've done, where I've looked at the restorative practices in my county and everyone who is involved. Then we take this concept of ecologies, and then we look at all of the manifestations of these practices, and then we look at these specific conversations, right, within each of these. So I could take victim offender mediation and victim offender dialogue, for example, at the bottom of the screen and say, where does that, what are all of the documents and conversations involved in that, those mundane processes? So in order to make these manifest, I'm arguing to use concept of genre. And that's why we're focused on a grant on restorative justice literacy and justice, peace, and conflict studies literacy in our communities. So really simply, rhetorical genre studies is a field that gives us a lens, a framework to articulate what we're doing and what we intend to do to improve our conversations, right? And genre revolves around this usually written document that manifests a discourse community. So that's why I'm incorporating this into our grant proposal. So if we think about the types of genre that we have in justice, peace, and conflict studies versus the practices, then this is that intersection I'd like to establish. So what we have are community dialogues. These are practices on the left-hand column, restorative justice dialogues, or victim offender dialogues. Our community presentations that we make to town halls, to our local boards, advocating for change, that we make for dream stamps. And then also school-based restorative justice circles on a larger scale. And again, I think Clyde gave us that large governmental view, right? Truth and reconciliation commissions. And we have had several in my community in the last 2 decades based on Indigenous rights and past experiences. And then finally, more practices are these trainings. So as we know from writing grants, we know it's hard to assess the effectiveness of our grants, and it's our job to do that. So I find this right-hand column to be helpful for us, is how can we frame our work through genre, through those written documents that are manifest of different communities. And for us, it's going to be the conflict studies community, this restorative justice community. So local publications, such as letters to the editor, our scholarly publications, articles, our conference papers from today, how can we share those? Our presentations that we give to local community organizations on how to be more inclusive, blogs. What we have on the left-hand column, this visual here, is a blog from a victim offender dialogue facilitator on some very powerful experiences. How else can we capture that and let the community know the effectiveness of these programs so they will elect government officials who want to support these programs? How can we communicate this? websites, thinking about the Save the Kids websites, policy recommendations. I'm very interested in how the University of Utah process that policy. I'd like to share from Chris's experiences. I'd like to share those with members at my institution so we can do the same thing. Even writing grant applications and having this collective material behind us. And of course, when we're talking about the genre of peace and justice, we think about poetry and the Behind the Wall series from Save the Kids. So I'm kind of starting to map out just one small ecology, and that is that of victim offender dialogues. And the question becomes, what is everything involved in a victim offender dialogue? And if we just look at the compliance report, this large green circle at the end of the process, there's a lot of processes involved. Maybe this goes back to one of our first questions, which is how do we assess and identify empathy? So when I do one victim offender dialogue, I'm looking at a case referral, police reports, witness narratives, officer narratives. I'm doing pre-conferencing phone calls. I'm doing pre-conferencing meetings. I'm actually having the dialogue. And when you map it out here, it is a very significant component, but it really isn't that big of a part of this intricate web of relationships in this process. And then finally, they usually culminate in a compliance report, right? So how can we, as practitioners, think of a way to tell external members in our audience what exactly happens here? So that leads me into my proposal, right? And that's what I'd like to discuss in the Q&A session, which is how can we increase restorative justice literacy, right? And as I'm approaching this grant, I'm thinking about how do we learn about our RJ programs in our community? How do we develop RJ programs? And I think after Chris's fine presentation, we need to think about voices, centering voices, as he said. How can we document our work? Again, going back to the previous slide, how can we document all of these processes? What are the community needs, right? Centering those voices is super important. What are the indigenous perspectives should influence our work? In our region, we have to consider indigenous restorative practices, whether or not that's simply circles or whether or not it's Yazie's arguments on Navajo justice that strongly influence my work. How can we consider those? So the meat of the grant proposal is going to be to centralize regional restorative justice work through a center. And this can be a virtual center. I'd like to have a centralized place to store this information. How can we establish best practices in diversion, for example, right? Collecting participant narratives, sharing resources, developing community toolkits. This image I'm showing here is an extremely good diversion toolkit. If anyone hasn't seen it, I'll give you a link of it. Super helpful. How can we share materials on establishing and providing trainings? And then, finally, it's our consortium that we build. How can we sponsor each other in professional development through our consortium? What do we have to learn? I know that Dr. Nocella is going to be presenting on transformative justice, so I'm really looking forward to that as well. So the grant itself, I would like to propose a grant on restorative justice literacy. I would like to focus on several locations in the Southwest and California. Don't mean to exclude Clyde. I'd like to map and detail our ecologies. And within that, I'd like to identify the mundane activities that we do. I would like to emphasize literacy through genre and genre production. And we can be critical of genre and say it's exclusive. I'm happy to have that conversation in our Q&A. I'd like to build, and I take these next two lines from Sujatha Baliga's Restorative Justice Project from a $2 million grant they recently received from Open Philanthropy. Sujatha, I got to see her present at Notre Dame at the Kroc Institute presentation. She's wonderful, does some really good RJ work. So how can we build a political consensus necessary to institute programs that will meet with influential people, officials in the criminal justice system, political decision makers who can increase the acceptance of RJ? That is the overarching goal here. How can we advocate for RJ at conferences, to the media, with government officials within our communities, right? How can we get on the ground, and put our boots on the ground, and how can we support this? And so that's my goal. That's what I'm hoping we have for our conversation. And then I just wanted to share a couple of my sources with you if you're interested. These are some of the arguments that I mentioned. So I will stop my share and open it up a minute early for our discussion. And thank you for your help with my sharing the screen. I'm going to turn my other screen on right now. Excellent. Do we have any questions? Well, we've got 9 minutes left in the Q&A, so I'd be happy to talk about anyone's experiences on writing community grants for restorative justice, anything I'm missing on any of my slides. I'd also be interested in hearing about any of the genre that I'm missing. That's what I'm really most interested in hearing. So if we'd like to kind of go back to my slide on the genre of peace and justice in our community, see what I'm missing when we talk about policy recommendations, websites, blogs, presentations. I'd love to add to this list. I think after our conversation with Chris, we can add curriculum. I'm trying not to be too academic here, but I think curriculum design is super important as we think about indigenizing our curricula. Any practices I'm missing from my list that any participants or attendees would like to add? How about anyone looking at their community, thinking about restorative justice practices within their community? Are there any areas that I have excluded here? Youth centers, right? We have our Rainbow Youth Center in Durango, which is a great organization. They are independent from our youth services organization.
Hey, Eric, it's Brian.
Hey, Brian, how are you?
Good. I'm just going to chime in here. I've only caught the final 15 minutes or so of your presentation, but I found that our local law enforcement agencies are a big advocate and a big highway vehicle to use for this restorative justice as the times are changing. And so utilizing them, I'm kind of seeing your screen in small, your genre screen, the previous one, and so they've done a lot for Durango and Southwest Colorado too as well. And so like whether it's brochures or them putting out things in their newsletters or in their articles or whatever. And so local law enforcement, the sheriff's office, Fort Lewis College, campus police, DPD, highway patrol, little blogs that they could put in. They're huge advocates for programs like this, and so utilizing them is helpful too.
Thanks, Brian. That's a great comment. I remember that training we put on. Was that pre-COVID? Oh my God, it seems so long ago.
Oh yeah, I think everything's been pre-COVID.
Exactly. So I remember that training, that our Restorative Justice 101 training that we put on pre-COVID, and Fort Lewis College Police Department showed up, and they were super interested. They were super engaged. So
Yeah.
that's a really great observation. Brian, since that's kind of your neck of the woods, you mentioned the genre, you mentioned kind of brochures. What are some other genre that you think I could include here when thinking about kind of the police? You mentioned DPD, the sheriff's office, and the Fort Lewis campus police. What other genres are they using mostly? I know they have a Facebook page.
Yeah, I mean, they have a Facebook page. I mean, we've given them brochures. I know that there's articles in the newspaper that they're doing interviews all the time about the changing in police reform and things like that. I'm trying to think. A lot of it is social media, you know, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, working through other, like utilizing them as a vehicle through other social service agencies, like sexual assault services or human services or whatever, and just kind of using them to spread the word, because for what I do anyway, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but they're the pathway through it everything goes through. And so, you know, police contact for things like that are going to end up with through victim offender dialogues and things like that. I mean, there's before it ever gets to human services or sexual assault services, it's going to get to DPD or the sheriff's office. And so so oftentimes I will see on SASO's website, what I'm trying to get to, or Human Services website, is little blogs about DPD or the sheriff's office. Or so it's almost like passively or secondarily they're advertising, or they're using their communication indirectly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That's super helpful. I've added curriculum design from our previous conversation. I've added this kind of police social media interviews, brochures, and you've helped me go back through my map right here, and I added Rainbow Youth Coalition, SASO, Human Services, right, as stakeholders to what we're trying to do, which is increase restorative justice in our community. So that's super helpful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that diagram, the mapping, you know, it was getting pretty big when I was thinking through everything. And then once you add the genre and the different conversations in each of those, then it can be a little bit unwieldy. So, but I'm happy to add to it as well. So thank you. That's super helpful. And Brian, do you think that the literacy idea will go over well with certain grant agencies talking about kind of restorative justice literacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're spot on with all of it. The main thing behind grant, whenever I hear somebody wanting writing grant funding for restorative justice and things like this, is they're all statistically driven. They want results, they want stats, they want to see how it's working, why it's working, what will work, when it will work, by when, things like that. And so the most stats you can collect, the better. I mean, if you can think of it, track it. Even if it's minute and ridiculous in your opinion, track it. And if you don't need it, then you don't need it. But yeah, I think you're right on.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do with the genre, is not be so, is to be more qualitative and not be so numbers driven, but you're right. I mean, that's what they want, and I'm gonna have to, but I'm hoping that the evidence of these written documents, these genre, I hope that'll represent some of the progress, not just through quantitative data, because that's all they want. You're right.
Well, it's not so much numbers. I mean, it is numbers at the end, but it's categories. It's you know what I mean? It's I guess I can speak more a little bit later about what I collect, the data I collect, but it's data. It's you know, it's yeah, it's categories of
Yeah.
whatever.
Even if it's narratives, participant narratives, it's still data.
Yeah, it's data, it's numbers. You're right, data.
Right. Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the help. I'm looking forward to writing this grant this summer. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for your Q&A, Brian. We just moved to 12 o'clock, and from 12 to 12:20, Brian's going to be presenting. The title of his presentation is Restorative Justice Programming, Administering an RJ Program in the Criminal Justice Setting. Brian works as diversion coordinator at the 6th Judicial District Attorney's Office, administering the Restorative Justice Program since 2014. This includes adult diversion, community conferences, and victim offender dialogues, among other programs. Prior to his experience in RJ, he worked as a probation officer and a crisis therapist in the community mental health setting. He also currently serves as president of the board of directors for the Sexual Assault Services Organization. And he's constantly striving to continue to find ways in which restorative justice can evolve to serve both offenders as well as community members and stakeholders. So Brian, I'll give you a private chat after 20 minutes, so you don't have to worry about keeping track of time. And the floor is all yours. Thank you.
All right. I'll see if I can figure this out.
I hope you do better than I did. My start was a little rocky. I have 2 screens and it kept showing my notes page. So the man behind the curtain, Will, here, he can answer any questions you have.
Yeah. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right. It's pretty basic. Yours is like super fancy and had diagrams and everything. And mine's pretty just basically informational. I'm going to get to the top here to the beginning. But anyway.
Can you put that in full screen, which is at the bottom right of your screen next to that Zoom? There's a little button there's a little drawing of a little projector. Or you can go up to slideshow and say show slow. Show. Or go click on slideshow at the top, Brian. Right now we're seeing the slides.
Seeing the what?
At the top of the tab, can you click on slideshow over in the middle? Oops, sorry. Expand that. Now go to the middle, top middle. Click on slideshow.
Slideshow.
Up, left. Keep going up, left.
It's oops.
Middle of your screen.
It's covered.
Okay. Don't worry about it.
Oh, there it is. It was covered up by a ribbon. I couldn't see it.
From beginning.
Was that?
Click on the from beginning button. Start show from beginning. It's over on the left. There you go.
Yep. Is it on?
No, it didn't change the screen. There you go. You're in.
Okay. It was covered up by a ribbon. Okay, that's my excuse. So anyways, this is more about kind of how restorative justice works in our judicial district and how, how we started it and whatnot, and what we do here. And it differs from agency to agency. We were one of the 4 pilot programs in Colorado back in 2014. There was a need for it and we jumped on board and ran with it. And it's been, in our opinion, highly successful ever since. And so kind of going forward, what our restorative justice looks like, it kind of falls under 2 categories. It's diversion and restorative justice, although they're kind of, it's all under the umbrella of restorative justice, but we kind of serve 2 different categories. So first off, diversion. How do I switch? There we go. So diversion, what diversion is most of you know, is probably just diverting criminal cases away from court. Our courts have been overloaded with these random cases. They're probably not random to the offenders who do them, but we're trying to get all of these cases, or as many cases, away from the criminal justice system as possible. These driving under restraint charges, careless driving, dog cases, as well as the kind of more serious ones, the assault cases, the domestic violence ones, substance abuse, the ones that we can provide treatment for, the state has provided us money. We're just about to break free of the grant, but in the past 6 or 7 years, they've given us treatment money to provide treatment to people, because the thought is if we can provide treatment to them so where they can get some kind of assistance and help, it's a better outcome, because it's basically like probation. The difference is they're not standing up in court and answering a plea. They're not saying guilty or not guilty. And at the end of it, they're getting their case dismissed. It's not following them around for the rest of their life. They're not, I'm gonna have this so you guys can see me. There you go. So they're not, it's not following them around for the rest of their life, to where if they go to apply for a nursing job, it doesn't count against them. Sometimes it can, depending on the kind of job, but in the end, for the most part, it just doesn't show up on the record. So our purpose is to get as many of these cases away from the system as possible. The cases can be referred from anywhere: law enforcement, private attorneys, defense counsel, public defenders, obviously, treatment providers, people who come into their office for self-help and say, hey, look, I have a problem. I have a court case. I'm here to get help on the front end. They can call us and say, hey, look, this person, I think they'd be a good candidate for diversion. You know, they may or may not have an attorney. They could be pro se. Those are all factors in, but anybody can be referred from anywhere. A shop owner could call and say, hey, look, so-and-so broke my window. I have them on camera. I'd rather not press charges. You know, I'd rather go through an informal diversion process to where he just fixes my window. We can do all sorts of things. We get really creative. I think that's a benefit of the program. Kind of on the piggybacking on that, on the third point there is it can be, the diversion can be filed, pre-filing or post-filing. Post-filing is what we normally see, where charges are filed. They go through the district attorney's office. Criminally, they get charged officially, and then it comes to me, or it can be pre-filed. Law enforcement takes a report commonly. They say, look, this isn't even worth the district attorney's time. They email me the police report and say, hey, look, can you help this guy out? I'm going to have him call you, give him X number of days to report to you, and figure out a way to resolve his case without ever having to go through the charging process. We've had a lot of success with that. We just don't have a lot of cases to provide a lot of accurate data, because most often it's post-filing. But the pre-file cases are the ones where sometimes law enforcement refers them, or therapists or substance abuse counselors, store owners, things like that can call. Whoops, I think how do I go back? I need to go back. I'm not going back.
The left arrow and right arrow on your.
I don't have any arrows.
Bottom left of your white screen, there's a little arrow right there.
We're hidden. All right. Very computer literate. So a lot of the offenses we see are minor traffic infractions, what we talked about: driving under restraint charges and careless driving, driving without a license, things like that. We get assault on a peace officer cases a lot, both police officers, sheriff's deputies, as well as the hospital cases, the security officers there, they're peace officers as well. Trespassing, burglary. We do get DUI cases, both DUI and DUID, under the influence of marijuana cases. We're very careful to screen those out, the DUI cases, because they're very, it's a public safety risk having a DUI case. It's a public safety risk having them on deferred, much less diversion. So we're careful to screen who we put on diversion for those. But if it's a the breath alcohol or blood alcohol is 0.05, or there's circumstances where there's provability issues or things like that. It's a case-by-case basis. Domestic violence cases, I have a lot of them. That's honestly probably a majority of my caseload right now. It's kind of scary how many DV cases there are out there. Child abuse cases, we screen those kind of like DUI cases. There's obviously a victim involved, and it's a very sensitive issue. But we have a number of child abuse cases that have come through. Theft, ID theft, and drug and alcohol offense-related cases. They've decriminalized a lot of substances over the years since we've started, and substance abuse has always been an issue. So we have a number of treatment options. I wish there were more, but we have treatment options available in the community for those who need them. Those we do not accept. By statute, we cannot accept sex offenses. And anything involving serious bodily injury. And so if there's a careless driving resulting in injury, a DUI, the DUI crash, and the investigation, we get the medical report back, and it turns out that there's, six-figure damage or medical bills. We can't take that. As well as minors. Anybody under the age of 18 as a defendant, we have to refer them to La Plata Youth Services. They have the contract for all minors in the community. They go through the school-based restorative justice system. Anybody else that doesn't fit in basically those three categories, we look at on a case-by-case basis. We screen them out based on factors such as criminal history, the details of their offense, whether there was a weapon involved. Chances are, if there's a gun involved, I'm not saying we won't take them, but it's a very sticky wicket, because it's a public safety issue, basically. We always take victim input into account. We want to know what they want the case to look like in the end. We don't have to follow their input, but we always want it. And restitution owed. If we're not going to take a case where there's restitution owed of $50,000 and the person doesn't have a job. That's setting everybody up to fail. Those cases are really difficult to resolve, but we know that diversion is probably not the best outcome. Things we use for diversion, kind of methods we use to help them out is public service, basically just volunteer work, same as probation, drug and alcohol treatment, as I talked about, same as probation, domestic violence treatment, mental health treatment, substance abuse testing, basically drug and alcohol monitoring to make sure that people are remaining sober, restitution services. We have an array of online education courses, everything ranging from parenting classes to Alive at 25 classes to hunter education safety, you name it. I think we've partnered with a company called Advent FS. I think they're based out of Kentucky. They have probably no less than 20 different online classes for anything that you could want an online class for, as well as driver license assistance for the drivers, people who drive without licenses. Basically, I just kind of guide them through the DMV process and helping them get their license back if they need it. There's no financial assistance related to that. It's just helping them navigate the DMV, which even I need help navigating the DMV sometimes. So on the flip side, there's the restorative justice program that we operate. That was the diversion kind of focus. The restorative justice, that focuses on the reconciliation between the offender and the victim, as well as the offender and the community, because the damage is done to both the victim and the community. And so we're looking for accountability. That's the huge part. That looks like in a number of ways, from victim offender dialogues to traffic conferences, to hospital conferences, hospital safety conferences, which we haven't had many of, but we've offered that because it was brought to our attention that there was a lot of backlash against like hospital security and medical staff, nurses and doctors, people who were coming in under the influence, acting out against hospital staff, and they voiced the need for that, and so we made that available to them, because just like an offender out in the field swinging at a police officer, a nurse is a victim as well if somebody comes in and swings at a nurse. So these conferences and victim offender dialogues give people a safe space just to kind of express their concerns and their differences and their disagreements. It brings the officers into the room. We've had to go virtual here lately, obviously with the pandemic, and so we've brought all the agencies in a virtual room to educate people on safe driving techniques, road awareness, things like that. We had a substance abuse conference to educate people on just the dangers of driving under the influence of drugs, and what it means to just smoke one joint and get in the car, for those minors who really don't have any idea the effects of what that does. And victim offender dialogue, obviously getting the two people or the two parties in the same room. And I think I heard Erik talk earlier about the process of pre-conferencing and meeting with individuals, sitting down with them in a safe space, in a controlled environment, and going through the accountability process. I mentioned also the virtual conferences. We've partnered with local law enforcement with all three agencies, the State Patrol, DPD, the Sheriff's Office, the hospital safety conferences, dialogues. We offer public service, again, through restorative justice, which is volunteering, restitution. I use the common example of a store owner downtown getting his window shattered, or a homeowner getting his car damaged. If he just wants his property repaired, and maybe a chance to sit down and talk to the individual, they have a victim offender dialogue and have his tire paid for, or his window fixed, or something like that. Restitution will be paid back, and victim offender dialogue scheduled. So we have kind of a menu of options, and this menu is kind of ever evolving. We kind of consistently look to add to it, which is why we reach out to stakeholders and try and get as much feedback and buy-in as possible, because the more options in our community we have, the better. We have, as I mentioned, for grant reporting reasons as well as our own reasons, the state wants statistics. And so we've compiled statistics from 2000, and we started in 2014, but tracking from 2016 for the purpose of the grant. And in 2016, we enrolled 361 individuals. 196 of them have entered some kind of treatment. Now, treatment can include anything from the traffic conference to substance abuse treatment, to domestic violence treatment, to mental health treatment, to the victim offender dialogue. That's kind of a big umbrella of what we consider treatment, but they're receiving some kind of help to address the problem they came into our doors for. Out of those 361 people that enrolled, 275 of them succeeded. 53 of them did not succeed, and the remaining balance of whatever's left out of that 361, we're still on my caseload at the end of that year, if that makes sense. They were still working out or working through the program. In 2017, it's the same categories. 120 of them were enrolled, 60 entered treatment, 114 succeeded, and 33 of them did not succeed. And there was obviously some carryover in some of those participants from 2016. You notice those numbers were a lot lower than the 2016 numbers, and that's because there was a restorative justice facilitator in 2016 who left, and she was at the time the only restorative justice facilitator. She left and moved across the other side of the state. And so it was just me doing just the diversion program then. And so we then had to kind of rebuild our RJ program, at which point in kind of late 2017, early 2018, we then brought on Erik and another gal to kind of rebuild the program. So I didn't really have a restorative justice program in 2017. So the numbers really kind of fell off there, is why you see the low enrollment. But we kind of got back up and going again in 2018, 242 enrolled, 145 in our treatment, 136 of them were successful, 40 of them were not. You can kind of read through the numbers of these years on your own as well, 222. The successful ones are the ones that stand out. I mean, the unsuccessful ones, you always wish were lower, but you're always going to have people that either check out. We had a lot of people abscond. You know, the truth is we deal with a lot of people who they're either homeless, they're on the kind of poverty level of the economic scale, and so they don't have phones, they don't have transportation, and so once they leave my doors on the front end, I try and call them literally 10 minutes after, and the phone's disconnected, or maybe the phone didn't even exist, and so I can't find them again. And so a lot of them just absconded, and I never heard from them again. So I think I have somewhere the statistics of absconded versus didn't complete the treatment versus reoffended versus whatever the other reasons are. I think I have those somewhere. That's 2020. You can read over them. Getting into it, restitution, we hang our hat a lot on our restitution numbers. And in 2016, we had unbelievably 100% successful restitution rate. We are really choosy about who we accept and how we keep an eye on our time. I'm kind of going over. I'll breeze over this. Our restitution rates are pretty successful because we're really, I'm just going to go over these. We're really picky about who we accept in restitution. Their ability to pay, whether they have a job, how much they owe, who they owe it to, where they live, things like that. We have really good success rates with collecting, plus I'm really good at nagging. I used to be a probation officer and collect fees, and so it's one thing they taught us was how to collect money. Last year was not all that good. There was, my disclaimer to 2020 was there was 2 big cases that we didn't collect on, and we never heard from them again. And so that really skewed the numbers. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. So the total restitution, we have a 72.5% success rate, $58,000 totally collected, which I think is fantastic for a small area like us. And finally, I'll save you all the other slides because they're just narratives basically. But in 2016, after 1 year of completion, program completion, 89% had not reoffended. In 2017, after 1 year, 90% had not reoffended. 2018, after 1 year, 94% had not reoffended. So we're seeing the numbers really, really work well. And in 2016, the 3-year recidivism rate, 93% had not reoffended. I'm going to skip these because that's kind of a long story. The 2017 3-year recidivism rates hasn't been sent to me yet. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we do things here. I started from scratch and nobody's ever told me differently. And so I keep getting good results. And so I get feedback from people like Erik and the community, DPD, the Sheriff's Office, the state, obviously. And so as much input as I can get, the better. And I just kind of keep rolling with it. And I welcome any and all feedback. The more questions, the better. I work with all the agencies and I just keep seeing good numbers, and so I keep going with it. If anybody has any questions, ideas, I'm all ears because I think what we do is great work, and I assume, I don't know anybody listening here except for Eric, but I assume everybody here is a vested party as well. So if you have any questions, I'm all ears, but it's a great program.
Thank you, Brian. If you want to stop your screen share, we can go back to the collaborative screen. Thank you so much for your talk. I've just used the chat room to remind the attendees and the panelists to please use the Q&A feature. We got it going this morning, but it's been a little bit quiet since then. So Brian, thanks a lot for your talk. I really like how you talked about giving voice to victims as I'm thinking about our plan for our consortium. I think that's super helpful. I really like how you pointed out the need in the community for the homeless population, for the houseless population, to have a center to means of communication for participating in RJ. I got a question or two for you. One is, have you ever had anyone like critique the concept of diversion? Like, oh, that's unfair. Those people need to be punished. And have you ever, and you know, of course, domestic violence, child abuse, those might warrant a little more. Those are touchy. I don't think we have time to talk about those in our 4 minutes left. But I'm just thinking about audiences and how we communicate. And that grant that I pulled from, it said, we need to build political consensus to institute programs by meeting with influential people, such as officials in the criminal justice system and political decision makers who are able to increase acceptance of RJ. So what do we do to the people who are skeptics?
I think that depends on who the skeptic is. I mean, we've not had a lot of pushback from political figures, community members necessarily. I mean, I get pushback every day from victims because obviously they're victims and you know, they've had damage done to them, whether they're a victim of domestic violence or anything like that. And those are the toughest ones to explain it away. And it should be. I mean, somebody who's been physically hurt, a spouse who's been physically abused, that's a really, really difficult conversation to have as to why this person's not getting prosecuted. And I really struggle with that every day. I have had conversations with individual police officers who don't necessarily believe in what I do. You know, they're more of the prosecutorial type. And I kind of fashion it in the sense of, you know, this is the same concept as supervised probation, which is at most what this offender would have gotten to begin with. If they would have gotten supervised probation, they would be getting the same treatment. They likely would still be on like the same result. This way I have money to pay for it. Probation doesn't necessarily have money to pay for it. I do. So that they're getting set up to succeed a little bit more on my end. We're more closely following them a little bit than probation, depending on the offense and whatnot. We have far more programming to help them than probation. Probation doesn't have the traffic conferences and things like that. They may have access to it, I guess, now, but since we created it, plus they get their case dismissed, which again, that's the main sticking point for Durango Police Department and the Sheriff's Office is why would you dismiss their case? And the whole point is, or my point is, they learned something from it. They're not going to reoffend. They're going to get something out of it. We're going to set them up to succeed.
Great. So I think you have identified that there's a need for a little bit of diversion and restorative justice education, that programming you mentioned. And that's two completely different audiences, victims and police. So yeah, that's great. I think that's something I'd like to develop more is how we can create that programming to educate people about why we're doing what we do.
Yeah, it's basically, I always tell myself or tell people that I'm, you know, it's basically pseudo probation. It's the same thing as probation, only we have more options, we have more funding, It's just, if you can get past the whole concept of it's a better outcome for the offender and get past the whole, you deserve this and you deserve that and you deserve, you know, which we all as a society, I think, have to get out of the mind frame of, because they're going to get help in the end. We want to set them up to get the best help and have them succeed doing it. That's the whole point of what we do, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. We just ran out of time. I had one more question, but I think the next presenter is ready for the 12:30 slot. I did want to ask you maybe super quickly. Is our district more progressive considering the state? Where do we sit in regards to other districts within the state for restorative diversion practices?
I don't know how to quantify where we sit, but we are more progressive. You know, I do know that. I've sat in on the meetings and I've talked to my boss about it. And, you know, we are one of the more, if not, we're not the most, but we are one of the more progressive districts in the state of Colorado, absolutely.
So that broadens our need to communicate and educate people, because we're preaching to the choir in our district.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk, Brian. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, it's the 12:30 slot, so now it's time for the fifth talk of the day, and that is Katie Lewis. And Katie's talk today is entitled "Using Queer Ecology to Foster Peace and Justice." Katie is an associate professor of English at Salt Lake Community College. It's good to know that us English professors are representing here. There's no hierarchy to following ways of being that Lewis inhabits her body and mind. She's a teacher, lover, activist, mother, hiker, sometimes marathoner. I love this one, by the way, and need to find more time for writer, aren't we all? As a sexual violence survivor and bisexual woman, raised in a very patriarchal religion, her teaching and writing investigate the myriad socio-political and environmental experiences of intersectional identities, stories, and histories. Three of the major frameworks for her research, I also like this part about her bio, teaching and writing, are exploring themes of silence and voice in the United States, the power and importance of real representation, and the necessity of unerasing intersectional LGBTQ+ histories. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you for that introduction. So in order for me to talk about queer ecologies and applying queer ecologies to make more expansive problem solving, make more intersectional ways of problem solving and ways of being, I need to talk a little bit about eco-criticism. So eco-criticism emerged as a kind of literary and cultural theory derived from environmental studies and this consideration about the ways in which cultures, particularly Western cultures, colonizing cultures, have talked about nature and who gets to talk about nature and who gets to have their talks about nature published. So eco-criticism is a theory that examines the relations between writers' texts and the world. And here the world is synonymous with society. At least that's the way that the Western culture, colonizing cultures have constructed notions about world being conflated with society. And so the social sphere in most schools of literary, political, cultural theories kind of wrap around that idea of thinking that the world equals society. Eco-criticism says, nope, the world includes the entire ecosphere. And so eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. To extend that out, eco-criticism is also a study of the relationship between the worlds that humans think that they inhabit as separate from the physical environment, and eco-criticism, especially second wave eco-criticism, disrupts all of that. So just as feminism examines language and literature from a gender conscious perspective, Marxism looks at class issues and alienation as well as modes of production, eco-criticism takes an earth-centered approach to literary studies. Queer ecology also does the same thing, taking an earth-centered approach to understanding facets of identity that are linked to sexuality, race, ethnicity, ability, class, gender, education, and just humanity's relationship with the environment, as well as the ways in which we have used in cisgender white patriarchy, this idea of natural and what happens in the natural world as a way to other dehumanize LGBTQ+ people. So eco-criticism takes as its subject, to further this discussion, the interconnections between nature and culture, specifically the cultural artifacts of literature, film, policy, public policy, to negotiate between the human and the non-human. So if you are going to take up eco-criticism, you are literally, if you parse out the Greek words that eco-critic comes from, you are a house judge, judging the ways in which humans treat their relationships to the environment. So there are two major waves. There's been some argument about if there's a third wave, if it's just an expansion of the second wave. We won't get into that debate today. So first wave eco-criticism is where you see writers, policymakers, activists trying to speak for nature, where they combine humanities and the sciences as methods for creating awareness and inventing responses to environmental concerns, environmental disasters, and how humans are impacted by those disasters or concerns. Second wave eco-criticism really breaks down the human non-human binary and takes a biocentric view of humanity's role in the world. So there is no human non-human binary. We're all part of the planet, we're all part of the biosphere. And so it expands the meaning of environment to include anything that is urban is also natural, is also nature. It's just marked more by human invention. And then second wave eco-criticism also takes up examining environmental racism and endeavors to seek environmental justice, specifically for groups that have experienced or have a history of colonization, and the ways in which hegemonic communities tend to leave those communities out of public policy conversations and out of conversations about access to resources and the health of the resources that people have access to. The water protectors with the Dakota Access Pipeline are a perfect example of that. Fighting for social justice and fighting for environmental justice, and they're both bound up into each other. So Bruno Latour, who's a French sociologist, developed this theory. He wasn't the first one. He's just couched it in these terms, to think about actors within certain networks and how the actors within certain networks connect to each other, and how those relationships can foster things like environmental disasters, resource disasters, pollution, and how those same actors within those networks can also reshape and reconfigure the use of resources, the use of labor, to foster more healthy environments of which humans are a part. So his argument is we must follow the complex global networks and relationships among the objects that we consume and our impacts on the environment. So not thinking just about the clothing that we purchase or the food that we buy being organic. What are all of the relationships of production that helped that bit of clothing or that helped that organic whatever arrive at the grocery store? Who was harmed and or helped in the processes of making the things that we consume? And what's happened with industrialization and with capitalism, especially late stage capitalism, is we are entirely stripped from our relationships to the things that we use, that we wear, that we consume. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't actually know where the things that we consume come from, and the actual human, environmental, and all the other kinds of costs, not just monetary, that come with that. So he's asking us to look at our relationships within the networks that produce the things that we consume. And this brings us to considering that we are in the Anthropocene. So it's the age of the human, where humans have become a literal geological force on the planet that is also leading to the 6th largest mass extinction on the planet. And the reason that's happening is in part due to climate change and the ways in which landscapes are changing. The animals and the flora and fauna in those landscapes, by the desert, by the coasts, cannot adapt as quickly as the planet is heating up in certain parts, cooling down in other parts, or when we have glaciers melting. And so that is what is propagating this 6th largest mass extinction on the planet, is what humans have done to it, and the inability for animals to adapt as quickly as they're going to have to in order to survive. And that comes back to the actor network theory and thinking about the ways in which we've stripped ourselves from our relationships to the things that we consume. That also includes animals and plants who we may not have found a capitalistic profit-making value from. They still have a right to exist even if we can't profit from them. And we've stripped ourselves from that fundamental truth about our relationship to a planet that we live on, not that we own. And so eco-criticism, as well as queer ecology, examines social constructs, particularly the binary ways in which a lot of Western cultures, that's not to say it's only Western cultures, but Western culture tends to operate on the binary opposition, this thinking that things can be categorized in neat either or categorizations or neat little boxes. So I have a few listed here: subject, object, human, nature, consumer, conservationist. All of the facets of that binary on the left side are things that we have often politically, culturally, economically, and just structurally have privileged over the terms on the other side of the slash, on the right side of the slash. And so what queer ecologists and eco-critics try to do is to disrupt all of those binary ways of thinking about these either or categorizations that try to make people, places, things, nature fit into neat little boxes, which we actually don't fit into. And so that's a very anthropocentric view of the ways in which humans have a relationship with the environment, that we are at the center of things and everything else is around us, there to support us or there for our use. What an eco-critic and a queer ecologist would say is that's nonsense. That's actually not helpful, and it creates more exploitation of the land, of resources, and of people that ultimately will become agents for humanity's own destruction. And so they take on a biocentric view of the world in which humanity's importance on the planet is decentered. And so the whole biosphere becomes the center through which things exist, emerge, are reshaped, rebirthed, recreated. And this takes or asks us to explore the complex interrelationships between the human and the non-human, that there are things on this planet that are more human than humanity. And taking that approach will help us see that our place in the world, while small, is still important, but it's not the only place in the world in which life and just the freedom to belong can exist. So queer ecology and eco-criticism, and I'm just going to start combining the two now and threading them together, takes up some concepts from Marxism in order to examine some of the things that I had just talked about regarding the actor network theory, the Anthropocene, extinction, but just our own thinking about our place in the world. And so capitalism has created, taking up Marx's approach, a variety of different forms of alienation. And so this disconnect between who we are, the things that we do, how we relate to other people, and even the work that we're engaged in. And so Marx argues that there are 4 types of alienation that come from capitalism and the misuse and exploitation of labor and resources. So we are alienated from nature because we are only interested in what profit margins nature can provide. We're alienated from the self because we don't really fundamentally know who we are, because our work and our endeavors to make money to live become subsumed, or our self becomes subsumed by those needs. We are alienated from others because we can see others as competition for resources, competition for promotions, competition for access to certain things that we have been told that we need in a capitalist society. We are also alienated from our labor. The people who own, the factory owners, even the college administrators, the board of regents or whatever, in a way own our labor. And so we can't even call that ours. And so the things that we create, even if it's something like a sandwich or a hamburger at McDonald's, that is still an act of creation that we are alienated from. It is owned by the people who own the businesses. And all of that alienation can lead to a feeling that we don't really belong in the world that we are a part of. And this brings me to 4 other conceptualizations of alienation. If we think about the ways in which LGBTQ bodies, minds, identities, and histories have been appropriated by white cisgender heterosexual patriarchy. We are alienated from our bodies because how we think and do and be in the world as queer people is often relegated to a certain kind of trope or standard to fit in order to either be the cultural other because we don't fit the cishet norm, or that we have to fit a certain kind of identity performance of being LGBTQ+ that will make the hegemony comfortable. And so we can be alienated from our bodies in that way. We're also alienated from our identities, especially people who choose to not take on labels in the LGBTQ+ umbrella. Queer has become one of the ways to push back against that need to have a clear label with a clear definition. And so this need to try to define people through certain labels from the hegemonic community can become a way in which we are alienated from our identities or how we would want to self-identify. We can be alienated from our pleasure. This is particularly true for women, for trans women who are also women, and for anyone who doesn't fit in those neat male-female binary categorizations. Women aren't supposed to want pleasure. Trans people aren't supposed to want pleasure, or the cishet community can see that as abnormal, which it's not. And so finding pleasure in queer ecology becomes one of the main ways you can push back against the hegemony, against capitalist endeavors that would continue to exploit bodies and minds. And so this need for pleasure, and pleasure doesn't just mean sexual pleasure, it can mean pleasure in just being in oneself, in one's body, embracing one's identity, taking on any label that we choose to take on, or not taking on any label if that doesn't fit with who we know ourselves to be. And all of this alienation can lead to an alienation from peace. Not being able to feel like you are you in your own skin as you move about the world can lead to that alienation of peace. Feeling like you always have to put on a performance for a boss, for competition, for either promotion or resources or other sorts of competition can alienate us all from peace. And that also means we can be alienated from having peace within ourselves when we go about the world and the world tries to police our bodies because of our gender, because of our sexuality, because of the color of our skin, because of our class, because of our ability. And that all leads to alienation of peace. If you can never feel quite safe anywhere you go, that leads to all of the other forms of alienation. There's a really fantastic gardening collective in Atlanta comprised of LGBTQ+ Latinx individuals, and that's how they identify. So that's why I'm using the term Latinx. And the co-founder, Israel Tordoya, says, is our current, so he went to pharmaceutical school and came back to his community to try to heal it, to help it, and to foster a way in which to remove food deserts from the landscape, especially in the midst of COVID-19. So he poses a question: is our current pharmaceutical system really the best way to make people healthy? Or is it just like putting a Band-Aid on the wounds that capitalism and the pollution of our planet is causing? So this queer ecological approach to considering the ways in which our multiple layers of alienation can create a lack of health, a lack of connection to the land, and more pollution is hugely important. And they are taking the lead with their gardening collective, Mariposas Rebeldes, to try to reshape the ways in which the Atlanta community thinks about gardening, thinks about access to food, thinks about the ways in which we can come together to provide for people their basic needs, and the ways in which the workshops that they found and ground and teach can help reshape the community so that they can not only make food for themselves, but food for the people around them. And this became fundamentally important with the COVID-19 pandemic because so many people lost their jobs, and the situation with food deserts and food insecurity in Atlanta became increasingly worse. And so this queer ecological group comes together and finds ways to change that fall outside of the norms of government intervention or the welfare state, which is often used against the people who actually need it most, and found a way to respond that was unique and that was fundamentally queer. So I'm just going to skip over a few things so there's time for questions. This is the group that I was just talking about that established the Gardening Collective in Atlanta. And one of the foundational principles that this group talks about, and that is also a principle in eco-criticism and queer ecology, is interdependence. So the Enlightenment gave us this way of thinking about the self as that we're completely independent people. And usually they were talking about men because patriarchy. But what Leonard Davis, a disability studies expert, what queer critics and what eco-critics argue is that to be a person means to always be in some way dependent on other people and on the environment. And so to be a queer ecologist, applying queer ecology ideas to reshaping the ways in which we respond to things like crime, oppressive systems like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, is to understand that we cannot work alone, we work in community. And if we work in community, that's how we survive and thrive. That's actually how human beings operate as a species on this planet. And one of the things that the group also brings up is food autonomy as more like the capacity to choose what foods we can grow, process, and enjoy and share. When a community satisfies those needs, nobody's hungry. That is a perfect picture of food autonomy. We don't have that anywhere in the world. And that's exactly what this gardening collective is trying to foster in Atlanta and then expand to other communities. I put their not their email address, their website address at the very bottom of this slide. If you can't see it or would like me to post it in the chat later, I can do that too. And if there's any way that you can be a part of helping them with their movement, that would be fantastic. So queer ecology, to sort of finish up, it takes all of the things that I was just talking about with eco-criticism, thinking about the intersections of the environment and capitalism, and it uses queer theory as its base to denaturalize assumptions about biology, sexuality, gender, and other facets of identity. To be queer is not just to be an identity, it is also an action. So to queer something is to resist the regimes of the normal and to critique cultural construction of identity. So in applying this to what we've been talking about today, and I missed some of the presentations, but what I gather is you can queer justice, you can queer policing, you can queer any of these systems in which humans operate within this larger world by removing those standard tropes that we go to, like they were resisting arrest, or they deserved it, or it was he said, she said. What's to queer any of that, you step back and you go, why is this our default? Why are these kinds of reactions to violence in the world fundamentally falling back on often victim blaming, and or this idea that punishment always works, and that is a way to reform. So a queer ecology would say, what's a better way to think about reform? What's a better way to think about the ways in which our relationships to ourselves, our sexuality, our gender, and the environment foster certain kinds of situations in which people can be violent, can be victims of violence? And how does access or lack of access to resources fundamentally connect to the ways in which human beings behave, don't behave, and engage with each other? So queer ecology asks us to think about our sexual politics and relationships to the ways in which we can constitute nature and what we define as natural and unnatural. And so it draws from all of the different disciplines that I've talked about, plus more. so that queer ecology can dismantle the various dualisms, those binary oppositions I was talking about earlier, that humans apply to understanding nature and culture. It also applies to the ways in which we feminize and masculinize certain facets of the landscape. So calling the sun masculine, the moon feminine. I study post-colonial literature and theory. And in earlier post-colonial literature, a lot of writers who were men would tend to use women's bodies and what would happen to women's bodies in those texts as metaphors for the colonization of the land. So the ways in which queer ecology asks us to think about why we create certain gender identities to tell history, to tell stories, or to talk about our relationships with certain facets of the planet. And what's problematic about that? What does that lead to in terms of our societal thinking about men and women and people who don't fit into those male and female categories? So it looks at the power dynamics and the ways in which we construct and constitute nature, coming back to that idea of what we constitute as natural and unnatural. So we can apply a queer ecology to social justice activism to create more meaningful systems of justice, more meaningful ways to heal in community. It's not just the individual's responsibility. Ways in which we can foster belonging. My son's leaving for a trip. Apologies for that. And the ways in which we can create intersectional responses to violence, to environmental disasters, to crime, or to any of the other problems that society says we have to tackle, but we've been tackling for generations and still haven't found a way to meaningfully actually tackle them so they create less harm instead of more harm, especially for communities of color. And I want to end with this. I know I'm a little bit over time. I always overplan on my presentations. Alex Johnson is a queer ecologist, and his 2011 conversation about his work, I think, is an important note to end on. Queer ecology begins by questioning our understanding of sexuality in relation to nature, but it certainly does not end there. If straight identity means I am and gay identity means I am not, then queer can mean I am also. I see no end to the application of I am also as we work to protect the integrity of the world's ecological whole. And then he was working in a movement to stop Exxon. So I'm just going to skip over that part. What I love about the campaign is that it's a collection of people shouting, I am also. A local, a truck driver, a vessel of cultural wisdom, a living being. I am also concerned about the economy, about feeding my family, about posterity. I am also deserving of the right to fish, hunt, recreate, and live life free of cancer. And so this is how I would end. Anything that you've been talking about today, find a way to queer it by thinking about what he says here, I am also. And thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Katie, if you'd like to stop your screen share.
Yeah, I just can't see the.
Oh, that's okay. I have not received the chat. The Q&A tab has been pretty quiet today. We do have some new attendees, so I'd like to welcome everyone here and encourage you to use the Q&A feature. Katie, I really liked your talk. Thank you so much. I really liked how you, of course, your goal is to apply queer ecology to social justice activism, but then in the end, you kind of tied it into like the justice in the previous two conversations we had. And it really gave me a cool lens to think about alienation, access to resources, interdependence, and those ideas you brought up. And it also gave me more faith in restorative justice and Howard Zer's model of thinking about broadening that binary of victim and offender, person to whom harm is done, person who's caused harm, to include the community and to make other considerations. I did feel, I did look at those subject / object. I did think about victim / offender, and it is a binaristic system. Do you have any recommendations for avoiding that, if say in practice with a victim offender dialogue in a restorative justice program? I know this is like super in the weeds and not your area, but I think it's really fascinating. And then another follow-up, we only have 2 minutes left, but I presented on rhetorical ecologies earlier. I don't know if you are familiar with those
Yeah.
in the field of English. I'd love to hear about the intersection between queer ecologies and rhetorical ecologies. But you can answer either question. I think we have 1 minute left.
I'll take the first one, and then you and I can maybe have a back and forth about the other, the second one. One thing to really quickly say is the reason queer ecology is important is because it dismantles that idea that anything is natural or that things are unnatural and therefore should be dehumanized or less than. And so that's another reason queer ecology is really important, is it just like, let's stop having this conversation about what's unnatural as a way to dehumanize other and using the natural world to create that dehumanization. Because if you look at the natural world, it's actually really diverse and super sexual and asexual all at once. So to come back to your question, I am the trigger warning. I am the victim of sexual assault and rape. I am also a survivor. And the people that did those things to me were also victims of child abuse. And so I think it's helpful to remember that often the people who victimize have themselves been victims. And so how do we honor when people who have caused harm to other people, how do we help them heal from the harm that has been caused to them? And that's how I would say we disrupt that binary.
Okay, so I often focus on punctuation when I talk about conflict resolution. And I ask students to think about, when did that start?
Mhm.
When did that event actually take place? And not to use your example, but I was working with a youth who was caught stealing food at an area store. And that youth's parent was locking the refrigerator because the mother didn't like that youth's body type.
Yeah.
And then I think about punctuation as being, so that might be a framework to help us look at that conflict.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. That's super important and helpful. I really liked your talk. And we are 1 minute into our 1 o'clock session number 6. So hopefully you and I can continue the conversation. Thank you. Our 6th presentation today is by Zane McNeil, and it's entitled Precarity, Carceral Logics, and the Contemporary Vegan Movement. Zane is an animal activist and human rights advocate with over 7 years experience as a grassroots organizer, public policy analyst, government relations liaison, and litigation specialist with over a dozen human rights, environmental justice, and animal welfare organizations, including the ASPCA, HSUS, and most recently ALDF. They have a MA in political science at Central European University, is a fellow at the Institute of Critical Animal Studies, and a community ambassador to Sentiment Media. In 2020, they founded Roots DEI Consulting and Policy, a consulting group specializing in consistent anti-oppression equity work, specifically around trans and queer liberation for animal welfare organizations. They also are the co-editor of Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression, published by Sanctuary Publishers, and have the anthology Vegan Entanglements, Dismantling Racism and Carceral Capitalism, forthcoming from Lantern. Thank you, Zane.
Yeah, I feel bad making my bio that long now.
Took a couple breaths.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I'm gonna go ahead, and I have my my screen. Can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, because I also have my my personal notes on here, so let me know if it looks good. So my presentation is based on the introduction I'm drafting currently for the book on vegan entanglements and carceral logics. A little background of my work on that is it was a relatively new topic to me. I've been in animal advocacy now for over a decade. And I only started thinking about how animal rights really goes after prosecutions and what the problem of that is, especially when you want to be building solidarity with other movements. When I did my first book, and there was this great chapter by this journalist, food writer, Lee Kurtz, who was focusing on what a queer anti-carceral veganism could look like. So really excited to go after the last presentation on queer ecologies. So just a little background on the movement itself. There's currently this culture war happening in animal advocacy, specifically in animal law. concerning carceral rhetorics and material carceral goals and coalition work, where carceral veganism relies on and perpetuates a surveillance and detention framework to solve systemic issues connected to animal cruelty. So instead of going after big ag and these big companies, they instead target marginalized factory farming workers, collaborating with the police state, and then pushing for human confinement to relieve this confinement of animals. So that's pretty much my bio, but yeah, so my personal work though is really as a scholar advocate. I left my job at ALDF in December. They've actually unionized. They're the first animal welfare and animal advocacy organization to unionize in the US, which is super exciting. But there's also this big discussion happening currently about animal welfare workers themselves and how nonprofit industrial spaces really do harm folks there as well. So I kind of moved from working in these NGO spaces to doing activist scholarship, and has been working with the next speaker, Anthony Nacella, a lot lately with Institute for Critical Animal Studies and the media group there. So a little background, this was talked about slightly earlier with factory farming, and there was actually a lot of news about this in May and June. But so poultry workers and factory farmers in general are some of the most vulnerable and exploited workers in the United States. While profits were booming, they did not put the right restrictions in, COVID restrictions for the workers. So for a good while there were not dividers, there were not masks, and with increasing line speeds, people work very close to each other. And so a lot of people got sick. And a CDC disparity report published July 7th, 2020 found that 87% of COVID-19 cases at slaughterhouses occurred among racial minorities. So while the white managers were mostly untouched by the COVID pandemic, folks on the lines who are mostly immigrants, Hispanic and Asian folks really faced the brunt of the threat. And this is because of a structural issue. And so this disregard for workers is horrifyingly apparent in the Tyson bet, which you might have heard about. So managers at Tyson organized a winning take all betting pool, wagering how many of its employers at its meatpacking plant in Iowa would actually contract COVID-19. I wrote this piece for Sentient Media on that and sort of how slaughterhouse workers and meatpacking workers' lives really do not matter to the industry under capitalism, that really they are seen as animalized or dehumanized similarly to the way factory farmed animals are as well. There's also a great book called Every 12 Seconds by Timothy Packerat, which focuses on what it's sort of like to be a meatpacking worker and this kind of politics of sight. So while coronavirus ravaged through the meatpacking industry that month, Tyson's officials refused to shut down the Waterloo plant. Instead, they actually offered incentives for employees to come to work, ignore signs of employee illnesses, and offered subpar social distancing policies. So over 1,000 workers got sick and at least 6 died. And this is, even though COVID has exacerbated the issues at factory farms and meatpacking places, these poor conditions have always been there. It's not a new phenomenon. So big ag companies have historically endangered the most marginalized individuals in their quest for profit. Meatpacking workers have one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. They are regularly denied bathroom breaks. They're threatened with deportation. When workers actually voice concerns, that results in emotional humiliation, abuse, sexual abuse. Unfortunately, and this is what this presentation gets into, ignoring all of that, or maybe supporting it, being exacerbating it, perpetuating it. There's a long history of groups in the vegan movement that push for high sentencing for animal cruelty offenders. In Beyond Cages, which is sort of the keystone work on carceral veganism from an animal law perspective, Justin Marceau contends that many animal welfare groups, most notably the ASPCA, as well as ALDF, which I worked at, have conflated felony sentences with animal liberation. So some of the most notable cases with this conflation is prosecution of Brian Douglas after Mercy for Animals released undercover footage of North Carolina's Butterball factory farm in 2012. There's also the lawsuit, the Humane Society of the United States versus Hallmark Meatpacking Company. which actually led to the deportation of one of the folks prosecuted there. And then there's also convictions of Daniel Navarro, Rafael Sanchez Hera, as well as the ICE custody of Edgar Vanquez after the animal recovery mission's undercover footage of Fair Oaks Farm. So there's this long history, this long background of animal welfare organizations deciding to put their funding into undercover footage. So getting folks to actually be at the factory farms, sort of take gotcha footage of workers who face an insurmountable amount of cruelty, as well as being overworked, precariously employed, underpaid. And then instead of going after the companies that allow the normalized killing and slaughter that happens every day, every 12 seconds, that's the idea of Timothy Packerett's book, every 12 seconds, a cow in his factory was killed and dismembered. So instead of going after the companies that do that, that pollute the earth, that lead to environmental racism in North Carolina, they go after Hispanic and Black folks who are working on the lines. And so in the book that I'm working on currently, it's this idea that white veganism really is entangled with racial and carceral capitalism. So talking a little bit more about the unionization at ALDF, one of the main reasons behind it was not just ALDF's rhetorical communications tagline, "Herd an animal, go to jail," but also because in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, ALDF did not release a statement even mentioning George Floyd or Black Lives Matter, and really kind of posted one that really sort of leaned towards supporting the police. And so this really led to a fracturing or a very apparent tension within not just the movement itself, but even that organization between managers and staff. And so one of the questions I had behind that, is why would ALDF, why would these organizations do that? It seems like, why would veganism want to collaborate and assimilate into white supremacy and tactics of white supremacy instead of trying to build solidarity with racial justice movements, with environmental movements, to really dismantle the interconnectedness of the problems that capitalism has created? There was this great Civil Eats article that came out right around the time unionization was beginning to be talked about in Civil Eats, and it's about is veganism ready to reckon with its history of white supremacy, with its racism? White veganism is sort of a well-known buzzword now. You think of what a white vegan is, not just as a person, but also as a concept or even structurally. And that's sort of what the movement is. And when you think of the background of white supremacist tactics in the animal welfare movement, a lot of people automatically think of PETA's comparison of the lynching of Black Americans to slaughtered animals. So that's kind of like the dreaded comparison, the knee-jerk reaction there. One of my favorite scholars and someone I've worked with in my previous collection, Julia Feliz, is a non-binary activist scholar who has edited collections like Veganism in an Oppressive World. And they posit on this issue that empowering racists to continue their work in our movement, which is the animal welfare movement, only serves to show vegans of color that we do not matter in the vegan movement, despite being vital in the creation of the vegan world. So there's been a lot of internal discussions in these organizations about, why is our staff so white, especially around hiring and retentions? Like, why can't we just have more Black faces to tokenize? And so instead of really doing why is our space unsafe, there are more Black vegans percentage-wise than white vegans, instead of actually thinking about what the movement is and how assimilating into structures of power actually alienates and harms people. The solution for a lot of these organizations is, well, what can we do so it doesn't look like that? And there's this piece that came out by Haley Huguet not too long ago, about a month ago or so, that's really on how we hurt ourselves by assimilating into this. So the work that I've been doing is really thinking about why organizations, animal welfare organizations, are pushing punitive justice. You know, what does it mean to have a politics of incarceration attached to veganism, a carceral veganism, and why do we push towards captivity under the carceral capitalist state? And the main thing I keep coming back to, you know, is that under a carceral capitalist state, the Black body is already exploited for capital. You know, for-profit prisons incarcerates over 2.3 million people in the US in 2020, with total annual revenues of 4 billion, plus the exploited prison labor that happens there, which is usually seen as a sort of more than indentured, even just a servitude or a new form of slavery. So under this sort of carceral capitalism, captivity really does benefit the captor and harm the captive. Captors benefit socially, economically, politically, and or psychologically by holding another captive. And even the rhetoric of the power of carcerality is in itself a benefit to vegan organizations, white vegan organizations, because when you are threatening trying to assimilate into a power system that automatically marginalizes and harms people of color, it's what we kept hearing at ALDF specifically was that, well, the funding is coming because of the hurt animal go to jail, right? Because you are trying to carve out a space in a speciesist system already to help liberate animals, but it doesn't work like that. You really can't try to abolish any form of domination, including, you know, speciesism, without fighting against all forms of domination, including the carceral state. And so this text that I've been working on invites, and this is a little bit more about, you know, captivity. It's not simply a condition of confinement or unfreedom. It is a relationship between a being capable of intentional self-direction and someone who is substantially in control of that being's actions and movement. When we're thinking about captivity, you know, incarcerating a person, there's usually a rallying cry in the vegan movement of no cages, right? When you think about zoos, or you think about factory farmed animals, gestation crates for pigs, you know, battery crates for battery hens. And to not extend the anti-cage rhetoric for people is not only extremely flawed and problematic, but also you can't dismantle any cage without dismantling all cages. And so the collection I'm working on currently, it should be out next January. There's about 15 different contributors in it, and it's mostly dominated by white scholar activist voices, but there are a few really great international chapters, as well as chapters written by queer trans people of color, on not just what the issues with carceral veganism currently is within institutions, but also trying to imagine what an anti-carceral veganism and anti-carceral politics could look like. How can we build futures, abolitionist futures, vegan futures, anti-speciesist futures together based on that? So I'm really excited about it. It's going to be published by Lantern Publishing. They also did Af and Silko's book. And it was also partially funded by Veg Fund, who was able to give us stipends for the contributors who are queer trans people of color. So that's sort of where I am currently with this project. It's still very early in its stages thinking through this. We had originally had a few roundtables on it hosted by the Activist History Review, if you know them, inviting Lori Gruen, Justin Marceau on what anti-carceral veganism could look like. We most recently had another roundtable on this topic about 2 months ago with people from the contributors from this project. And really it's this, I feel like the vegan movement is currently at a crossroads of a precipice and a fracturing, not just for internally DEI issues that harm their staff under the nonprofit industrial complex, which is being addressed by new organizations like RARA, but also instead of the single issue versus consistent anti-oppression approaches in vegan advocacy, and how whether or not to build solidarity with external movements, which is being addressed by groups like Interconnected Alliance, which is being incubated by Synergia Animal. And so there's a lot of tension currently between the white men who are seen as the movement and the management who say that talking about other social justice issues will just cloud our mission. But when you inherently eclipse and marginalize the vegans of colors and activists of color who have been doing consistent anti-oppression, total liberation work for decades and critiquing the organizations for being unsafe, for sexual violence, for illustrating pay issues around patriarchy, and really eclipsing voices of marginalized people while centering white male voices, we are at this point in time with this movement that we need to actually not just performatively, but engage with change externally as well as internally, and try to build an abolitionist future together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Zane. I really appreciate your contributions. I also want to thank Katie for her comments in the chat. Katie, I was wondering if you'd like to ask any questions of Zane. I haven't received any in the chat board. This is not my zone. I'm more of an RJ practitioner. So.
This is the second time I've been able to hear Zane speak, and I've just blown away every time. So I don't have any questions per se, but that point about the interconnectedness, or rather the disconnection between animal rights movements and animals in cages versus humans in cages, and the ways in which we don't acknowledge that they're fundamentally both problematic and lead to more harm, is critical in transforming, doing truly transformative changes and making those changes happen in terms of our food supply, the way that we are connected and disconnected from it, but also in our court systems and just justice system, period, which is not based on justice. Just like animal farming is not based on health, it's based on production.
And power, I think really all of that.
Yep, exactly. So just thank you for that presentation. It was absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, and before I go, I'll talk to you after this, Katie, but I do work with queer ecologies and have a collection with the University of Kentucky on queer ecologies in Appalachia. So in addition to the vegan and critical animal studies work I do, I also very much try to raise queer voices from non-metronormative metropolitan areas. So it's really exciting to see how all of us sort of interconnects in justice and building solidarity together.
Yeah, I would love to connect. That'd be great.
I have received a question in the Q&A board, and it says, do you believe a Norway-style restorative justice model would be a good bridge to an abolitionist model?
I'm not sure if I'm as aware with Norwegian models of justice, but I think a lot of the work I've known, at least I remember being in high school and hearing that in Norwegian prisons, it was all about, education and trying to get people back to their families and really harm from the generational trauma they went through. So I'm not sure about the validity of that. But when I think about what justice is, like you were saying before, Erik and Katie, that so many perpetrators are also victims. So much of our harm that we do to others and that has been done to us is generational and based on systems and structures of capitalism that marginalize and displace and make it more difficult for us to have enough resources and really harm us psychologically as well. And so when you are trying to think of an abolitionist approach to veganism, part of that automatically is trying to meet people where they are and try to imagine a better world together that is based on less injustice. And so when I think about what I know of the Norwegian model, it really is about human dignity at its heart and harm reduction, which I think is important tenets for all of the work we do.
Thank you. We have another question. right you can stay zoned out if you want, it's okay, or your camera off. What do you believe the best steps forward are for creating more inclusive veganism?
Yeah, right away, a lot of people think veganism is a diet. I inherently think it's way more of a political praxis or framework that informs the work that I do and that others do. So much under capitalism, especially with our farm system, so many animals are seen as commodities that are not only exploited, but literally, consumed. And so when you're thinking about commodification and exploitation as a speciesist issue, you must inherently connect it to other forms of commodification and exploitation, which a lot of vegans of color and queer trans people of color have really written a ton about how all systems and hierarchies of violence and power are really all interconnected. So you can't be fighting against speciesism and the commodification of animals without fighting against environmental racism, without fighting against ableism, without fighting against cis heteropatriarchy. And so veganism really can't just be about a diet, and it really can't just be about only animals, because the structures that alienate us from our food and commodify and exploit animals are the same structures that do the same to other marginalized populations. And so an inclusive veganism has to really center voices from tons of different positionalities, especially ones that have been historically eclipsed to marginalized. So voices of color, queer voices, trans voices, voices of disability justice, and imagine those futures in solidarity and in connection with more than human futures as well.
Thank you. That's a great answer, and thank you. That's a nice framework, right, for veganism. Maybe I'll ask you the same question I asked Katie. I'm a novice in this field. Veganism and abolitionism are not directly connected. So would the diversion program that we spoke about earlier be a vegan political practice? Would that be a countering of a system? Or that's not a good definition of veganism, but yeah, what would that look like?
I have to check back on the program a little bit more, but in the same way, you understand queer as unnormative or deviant, right? And the politics of that destabilization, that's how I understand veganism as a politics. But I do think it is very important to also imagine solidarity with the more than human world as a tenet of veganism, and try to do the least harm possible, and then try to also understand animals and more than human communities as worthy of autonomy and political autonomy, and being anti-speciesist in that. So to be coming from a vegan framework, I think it would have to be inherent with that. I actually just wrote a piece on vegan sustainability that kind of talks through the tenets. And so I'll go ahead and share that in the chat.
Great. So it sounds like it's a little more transformative than restorative. In response to my question, the answer would be no. I think that the restorative diversion practices aren't transformative enough because they are part of the system. So thank you. That's super helpful. And I'd like to thank the attendees for such wonderful questions. Those were great. Well, we have 3 minutes left. If anyone has any final questions for Zane.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here with all of you.
All right, well, we'll take 2 minutes before our next presentation. Will, Anthony is up and he is logged in as an attendee. Oh, here he's at. Thank you. All right, well, it's 1:30. It's time for our 7th and final presentation. Anthony, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I can. Thank you. Sorry, you were logged in as an attendee, but now you're a panelist. Thank you so much. So our 7th and final presentation today is Dr. Anthony J. Nocella II, and his talk is entitled Transformative Justice, which we've been referring to all day, and Abolition Criminology. Anthony is a scholar activist. See, he's smarter than me. He doesn't use pracademic. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology in the Institute of Public Safety at Salt Lake Community College. He is editor of the Peace Studies Journal, Transformative Justice Journal, and co-editor of 5 book series, including Criminal Animal Studies and Theory with Lexington Books and Hip Hop Studies and Activism with Peter Lang Publishing. I knew that was coming, so I took a big breath when it was listing everything Anthony is involved in. He is the national director of the Save the Kids and executive director of the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. He has published over 50 book chapters or articles and 40 books. He has been interviewed by New York Times, Washington Post, Houston Chronicles, Fresno Bee, Fox, CBS, CNN, C-SPAN, and the Los Angeles Times. Thank you, Anthony.
Hello. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. Let me just kind of share that. And then we can begin a short conversation. All right. So Eric, do you see what my PowerPoint?
Yes, I do.
Okay, wonderful. So transformative justice and abolition criminology. Transformative justice has been around for a number of decades, influenced by ICOPA in 2010 at the International Conference on Penal Abolition. And the conference was put together by community organizers, Quakers, specifically that religious group, as well as families of incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, and First Peoples, where in Canada, where restorative justice was created in the 60s, 70s, I would say 70s, where transformative justice really emerged. You know, you're looking at the early 1990s to the 2010s. Or 2000s, around the concept and the development, right? And I have an article talking more specific about the history of transformative justice emerging out of restorative justice that comes out of the New Zealand Aboriginal people that were influencing the Mennonites that were there, and then people, of course, like Howard Zare and Ron Clausen and others developed restorative justice healing, taking accountability, responsibility. Of course, all people make mistakes, but some people do harms against other people. So abolition criminology, on the other hand, is not too old. It comes out of critical criminology, which comes out of radical criminology, which comes out of critical criminology, and challenging, coming from a Marxist perspective, a critical theorist perspective, and challenging kind of the classic orthodoxical frameworks of criminology and criminal justice. So, social transformation, right? And how do we change? Well, the people in power deny, and then they degrade, stigmatize people, and then deceive, like lying, manipulating, betraying people, then disrupting. That's by the oppressed. They disrupt, they dismantle, they destroy, and then transformation is possible with new ideas. If you look at genocide, if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at different social movements, women's suffrage movement, disability movement, they all kind of change, right? 4 A's of transformative justice, right? You first apologize. You second, take acknowledgement of what you're apologizing. Then you take accountability for what you're apologizing and acknowledge, taking acknowledgement of. And then you alter, and then you create social change, right? And then you have to take accountability of the actions, right? That you said, or did, or has happened. So very, very, very deep in conflict studies, conflict resolution, conflict analysis, conflict management. Those are 4 different fields within the framework. And so you might get a major or master's degree or a bachelor's degree in conflict studies. You might get it in conflict analysis. You might get it in conflict resolution or conflict a resolution or conflict transformation if it's the Eastern Mennonite University, which has a conflict transformation program, right? So all of those programs and theories and schools of thought identify conflict or crisis as both things, danger and opportunity. That opportunity is that we can learn about ourselves and others and the community around us. And crisis and conflict is the glue of communication. So the more you communicate, the more you're going to engage in understanding about yourself and the world, right? So one of the big things about conflict and transformation and transformative justice is hearing the voice of those that are marginalized. And those that are marginalized typically never make books or never present at TED Talks and never teach, right? And so I think, one thing that we can learn from is trying to provide space and place for those that are marginalized or oppressed. And Save the Kids, a fully volunteer organization founded in 2009, created a book series called Poetry Behind the Walls, and then works on creating Wisdom Behind the Walls, which is focused on providing space and place and support for those that are incarcerated on the national level of those incarcerated as adults. And Lucas, who's an amazing person, really kind of heads and coordinates the program on Wisdom Behind the Walls and supports, kind of talking with people and writing letters to people that are getting out or that are in, right? And there's a tremendous amount of amazing people at my institution at Salt Lake Community College that are writing and supporting people that are getting out. And the program, which is housed at Salt Lake Community College, called URP, Utah Reintegration Project, is doing great work on reintegration. And it's in a grassroots framework to help people no matter what their actions are. So that's really beautiful. So I think part of transformative justice, as I spoke just about, is very much a grassroots accountability, transformational process where abolition criminology, and I'll speak to that in a little bit, is coming from academics and scholars, right? And it's not as old. We're talking a decade or less younger than transformative justice, but both are very much newer than restorative justice, right? Which, I would argue came out of the 1970s, and then transformative justice came out of, the 2000s, ICOPA, and the first ICOPA conference, was in the 2000s and stuff of that sort. So please, and it's an international conference that goes all over the world. So to talk a little bit about actions in transformative justice, people say, well, if you don't want to incarcerate youth, what can we do, right? How can we not, damage each other in a punitive, retributive way? Well, ninth annual National Week of Action Against Incarcerating Youth. Organize an event, small or big, and join the movement as a group or individual for free to end the incarceration of youth. So That's kind of where we are. And it's the 9th annual. So I want you all to know about it, educate yourself about it, share it, and get involved. And that's a program that's really coming out of this transformative justice movement. But it begins, right? Transformative justice begins with youth, in my opinion. And I think a lot of people in it, we first need to get the most vulnerable populations from youth that are incarcerated on the border or youth that are incarcerated throughout the country to not be incarcerated. And so then we'll eliminate a lot of the recidivism, because majority of people that are in state prisons also are in have a background in juvenile justice. So if we eliminate juvenile justice as an option of incarcerating and providing wraparound programs, providing rehabilitation, counseling, therapy, mentorships, boys and girls clubs, community centers with tremendous amount of social workers. We will, or a lot more counselors and social workers at schools to address trauma and how to heal, right, properly. We will develop a move towards depopulating incarcerated locations like prisons and jails, right? So it begins with youth, and that's kind of one of the fundamentals of transformative justice. So the National U.S. Prison Reintegration Conference Call, I want to kind of note that that is a project of a number of organizations, and a lot of wonderful people at Salt Lake Community College are heading that up, as well as Lucas, specifically Utah Reintegration Project, is doing a lot of work at Salt Lake Community College. And then we're collaborating in a beautiful way, the National U.S. Prison Reintegration Conference Call. And our focus is education inside and outside, life skills inside and outside, housing guidance, and job guidance, right? So that's kind of what we are focusing on. And so people ask, what is transformative justice? What does it look like? And how do we move towards it? And I'm trying to right this second provide you concrete examples of how to get involved and not be a theoretician that is abstract. And I think a lot of this conference, Chris was speaking specifically about his programming in the Dream Center at the University of Utah, or Leilani doing amazing work, at the Utah Reintegration Program, even though she's not here, or a number of other people speaking or supporting this project. And I think there's a lot of people at Salt Lake Community College that are doing real work, not just theoretical work, right? And I think we need to be aware of that. Erik is doing tremendous amount of work in Durango, Colorado, right? And Brian has noted work, Zane, and I think trying to get back into nature and discuss how do we challenge frameworks of marginalization and oppression from an ecological queer perspective. Katie's brilliant presentation. I think we're talking about practical skills and steps and motions and moves. So that's why I bring this up today. So the next step is conflict transformation. And what does it look like? Conflict transformation, again, was influenced by restorative justice, and conflict transformation and transformative justice have a lot to do with each other. There's a conflict that occurs, check one. Recognize systemic problems, right? And transformative justice and conflict transformation have very similar processes. Social and personal responsibility. What are our responsibilities? Not accountabilities, but our responsibilities in our roles in the work that we do or in life. Be it a parent, a brother, a sister, an uncle, a cash register, a cashier, a plumber, a police officer, et cetera. Taking accountability of the actions that we've taken as in our roles. Self-reflection, how do we become better? Work on redemption, which might take a week, it might take a day. Build community, live holistically, and transform. Transformation is not just about me changing or an organization changing, it's around the whole society and community changing, right? And we need to be aware of that versus, for example, like a revolution where what you're doing is just changing one leader for another leader, right? And the causes and the crime of community-based solutions, right? So if we have healing and mental illness, we need social workers and therapists. Deviance, we're looking at philosophers and ethics and morals, right? My department is actually trying to work on, my Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice is working on a course focusing on ethics. So that really is exciting to see. Collaboration, collective organizing, and social theory when it talks about greed, looking at mutual aid. And we do have greed as one problem in crime. Critical social service providers. That's our needs, right? Social delinquency, look at family support, mentorship, and community centers. And then domestic violence, we need psychologists and counselors because that domestic violence could occur locally for one generation, or that could be intergenerational trauma that has gone on for many, many years because of domestic violence or systemic forms of oppression, right? So here is some, again, I was saying, here's some problems that transformative justice brings up and abolition criminology brings up, but more so transformative justice looks at solutions while abolition criminology focuses a lot of attention on the systemic problems. So we can gather power in creating social change to foster transformative justice and address the systemic forms of oppression within critical criminology through four different methods: social capital or status, being a police officer, lawyer, doctor, professor, teacher, counselor; mass community support, a mass rally, or what Black Lives Matter has is a mass organizing base, right? Economic leverage. You might just have a lot of money and being able to promote billboards and signs and flyers and stickers and shirts to push a particular cause or issue. Or the facts, like what are the facts and the truth of the particular case? Like this individual lied about this particular thing, or this particular cause of an issue was not the truth, and this is what happened in history in the civil rights movement, and we have to acknowledge that women were not provided the right to vote at the beginning of this country, right? So we need to kind of be aware of those issues, right? And facts and truth can create change if we educate people on that, right? The process of social change is not always easy. And so unaware of the social problem, willfully ignoring the social problem by the masses, resistance of change, which the masses are not easy to change, stigma of change, repression of change, tension with that change, like I'm not feeling comfortable about change, society and changing. And finally, society is changing, I'm changing, you're changing, we're all changing. Finally, we have social transformation, and that's the process of social change when we're discussing social transformation. In the process of social transformation, to be practical and to be legit with you all, there are 5 roles that active participants can participate. Peacekeeping, like I want to just keep you away from each other so you don't hit. Peace educator, I want to teach you about the processes and the history of creating peace and justice and conflict resolution, transformation, analysis and studies. Peace activist, I'm going to put a marginalized issue or a silenced issue to the center. A peacemaker is bringing people together, like a mediator or somebody like Erik, what he does in Durango or in the Southwest, or Brian, what he does. And a peace builder is trying to create programs, projects, and organizations, right? That provide sustainability for a community to have some infrastructure. So finally, in conclusion, I spoke indirectly and directly about abolition criminology and transformative justice. Abolition criminology does not argue for abolition, does argue for abolition, but does not create alternatives. That's the job more so of transformative justice. Abolition criminology is newer. as I noted, does not always mean abolition for all systems and may be specifically against one institution, program, group, or system, or a segment of a particular system, group, or program or institution. Abolition criminology is much younger in development than transformative justice, as I noted. Abolition criminology is emerging out of radical criminology, while transformative justice emerged out of community activists, former incarcerated people, families of those incarcerated, and First Peoples. Transformative justice is a process, while abolition criminology is a goal. Abolition criminology is emerging out of academia, while transformative justice is non-academic. And I think it's really good to know the differences, so how they can support each other and develop among one another, right? And that, again, I wanted to give a broad but very active, very practical presentation on the differences between abolition criminology and transformative justice. There are many wonderful groups. Generation 5, say Stand Up Philadelphia or Philly, Racial Justice Now, Save the Kids, Youth Justice Coalition, a number of others, Youth Voice, have participate or engage with transformative justice. And the American Society of Criminology has a group that focuses on abolition criminology, and they meet and they have a conference. They just had a conference. And Save the Kids is also putting on a conference called Transformative Justice and Abolition Criminology. And so if you want to get involved, please reach out to those organizations, read more. There's articles, videos. There's a tremendous amount of great videos out there around both of those different movements, fields, and ideas and concepts and theories, right? So thank you so much. I will end my presentation and then have opportunity for conversation.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for observing our time schedule and leaving 8 minutes left for Q&A. And thank you, Katie, for sticking around. And we still have a couple attendees left. I don't have any chat, any questions in the Q&A. So I'll just open it up to Katie if she has any, to Will if he has any questions.
Just again, I don't have any questions. I just want to thank Anthony for the opportunity to speak and rush through a presentation on queer ecology and using that to think about transformative justice. But all of the resources and the organizations that you were speaking about in your presentation, is there a way that, I guess I do have a question, is there a way that we can get more involved, provide some kind of remote support if we can't get directly involved with volunteering? What do you suggest for you?
So I would say, and this is for everybody as this is being recorded, is that people that want to get involved in abolition criminology or transformative justice, do some readings to know more about the definitions, the history, and the concepts. And I didn't have too much time to, give you the whole history of restorative justice or a whole history of abolition, but I wanted to give you a kind of a breadth of it, just a quick 20-minute introduction of those. But if you go to the SaveTheKidsGroup.org website, we do have a list of organizations and resources of those, of publications, videos, as well as organizations, as I noted, that exist, that are doing that beautiful work and important work.
Thank you. So Anthony, I'm thinking about Brian's recommendation to restorative justice and the Southwest Collaborative. I'm thinking about the role that genre can play, and queer ecology, of course, in giving voice to victims. And I'm thinking about your frameworks, and I'm thinking about mentorship on one of your diagrams recently. How can we incorporate mentorship in our goals with this, with our collective, and what would that look like?
can you ask that question? I was
Yeah.
kind of reading Katie's
One of your
message.
slides had one of the diagrams
Yes.
previous to the Peace Act, the different peace roles.
Yeah.
It was a social problems diagram.
Yes.
And at about the 9 or 10 o'clock position on the wheel, it had mentorship, right? You were talking about, it's a kind of a transformative approach to fixing issues.
For sure. And you want to talk more about how do you see mentorship? Well, there's a lot of people against mentorship, and because mentorship is an institutionalized, like citizenship or volunteering, are institutionalized words and positions. And so some people are for mentoring, some people are opposed to it. Some people are for peer mediation and peer mentoring in like in middle schools and elementaries and in high schools. And I can go either way. If there's a wonderful colleague of mine that talks about critical mentoring and talking about understanding power dynamics in mentoring and understanding that the people that are mentoring need to be willing to be challenged by those that are the mentoree, and knowing the race, class, gender, and ability and citizenship and other forms of identities that relate to social power and socio-political economic power. That and so that's critical mentorship in a nutshell, right? You can look up more about it online, and there's some great people doing. I would say if we are to give support, advice, direction to people, and with people, not at people, that we are we invited to that dialogue? Are we invited to that community? And if so, then how do we approach that community and how do we approach that dialogue, right? So that's what I would say is, be delicate when you mentor. Don't rush into it. And I think we can learn from the Black Panther Party, for example, on how they mentor. I think we can learn from decolonizing communities on how to mentor. We can also learn from some problems in mentoring and some faults in some of the larger nonprofits nationally that do mentoring, and some of the ways they've began mentoring and how they've changed because of legalities, fallouts, problems, etc.
Great. So it sounds like an ecological approach is required. One
For sure. Yes.
Move beyond the rhetorical situation, look at the context, but we also look at all of those mundane activities that are involved in the mentoringship, and make sure we're not perpetuating some patriarchal, teaching you how to behave type structure. Excellent.
Sure.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Thank you.
All right, 3 minutes left. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, Katie, thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, cis het patriarchal structures, which are in place, I would say, mostly all over the world. Yeah. Thank you so much, Erik, Will, and Katie for being on. Thank you, everyone, for presenting. Thank you, Will, for helping facilitate this whole apparatus of the conference and doing so much. And Erik, thanks so much for chairing. It means a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for all the comments. And Will, thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without you.
Will. Yes, thank you, Will. Thank you, Katie, for again, with your brilliance as well. Thank you. Take care, you all.
Goodbye, everyone.
So I guess we wrap up.
All right.
Erik, I'm going to text you. Sorry, cut this out, Will. I'd like to follow up on that question you asked and then talk about genre a little bit more.
Fun. When would you like the email or?
Well, I have your cell number because we had to rearrange schedules. So I'll just text you if that's okay.
Of course. Thank you. I'd love to have the conversation. I'd love the help.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye, Will. I'll log off too. Any other details?